During my daughter's engagement dinner, she picked up her fiancé phone, placed it firmly on the glass table, and glared at him with a look that could freeze boiling water. "I know exactly what you have been doing," she said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I stayed completely still, nursing my bourbon, letting the heavy tension hang in the air as I waited for his reaction. "I am Monroe Pierce, 75 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire from the unforgiving streets of the south side of Chicago. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled the man sitting across from me that night, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a father's instinct is never wrong. I built a logistics company from a single rusted delivery truck into a fleet that moves half the freight in the Midwest. It took blood, sweat, and a ruthlessness that I kept hidden from my family. I lost my beautiful wife 5 years ago, leaving me with one singular treasure in this world, my 32-year-old daughter, Maya. She is a brilliant surgeon, a woman who saves lives for a living. But brilliant people can sometimes be blinded by love, or in this case, by a perfectly tailored suit and a silver tongue. Enter Trent Caldwell. We were sitting in a private dining room at one of those ridiculously overpriced steakhouses in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where the lighting is dim, the waiters wear white gloves, and the menus do not have prices. Trent, a 34-year-old white man who introduced himself as an elite financial advisor, had insisted on paying for this celebration. But from the moment we sat down, his conversation felt less like a family gathering and more like a calculated interrogation. Trent swirled his wine glass, leaning back with a smug, entitled grin that he probably practiced in the mirror every morning. "You know, Monroe," he said, using my first name with a casual disrespect that grated on my nerves, "it is truly inspiring how far you have come. Maya tells me you started out as a grease monkey down on the south side, a real rags-to-riches story. It must have been tough for your people back then." I did not flinch. I just took a slow sip of my bourbon and looked directly into his pale, calculating eyes. "I was a mechanic, Trent," I replied, my voice steady and dangerously low. "And the oil on my hands paid for the medical school tuition of the woman you are about to marry." He chuckled, a hollow, nervous sound brushing off my response, as if I had just told a mild joke. "Absolutely commendable work, really." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes gleaming with a greedy curiosity he could not quite hide. "Speaking of hard work, Maya mentioned that old run-down wooden cabin you own up on Lake Michigan, the one you and your late wife bought decades ago. It must be a massive headache to maintain a dilapidated property like that at your age. Have you ever considered offloading it? I have some excellent connections in commercial real estate. I could help you liquidate it, get that heavy burden off your hands." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. The property he was referring to was not a dilapidated cabin. It was a prime piece of real estate sitting on a massive plot of land that was quietly being eyed for a major commercial buyout. It was appraised at $12 million. But Trent did not know that I knew the real value. He looked at me and saw exactly what his arrogance allowed him to see: an uneducated old black man holding onto a worthless sentimental shack, someone who needed a smart, educated white man to manage his assets. "I am not interested in selling," I said simply. Before Trent could push the issue further, his smartphone, which was resting face up next to his fork, suddenly lit up with a notification. The screen flashed brightly in the dim room. Maya, who had been quietly eating her salad, caught the flash out of the corner of her eye. She glanced at the screen, and in a fraction of a second her entire demeanor changed. The warmth vanished from her face, replaced by a cold, hard realization. Without a word, she reached over, snatched the phone, and slammed it face up onto the center of the glass table. The sharp crack of metal against glass echoed in the quiet, private room. Trent jumped, his smug smile vanishing instantly. "I know exactly what you have been doing," Maya said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and profound betrayal. I remained perfectly still. I did not intervene. I just watched Trent. A guilty man reacts differently than an innocent one. For a split second, I saw pure, unadulterated panic flash across his face. He swallowed hard, his posture stiffening. He thought he was caught. I assumed, just as Maya likely did, that another woman had sent a compromising text exposing a dirty affair. But then something fascinating happened. I watched Trent Caldwell recalibrate his entire reality in exactly 3 seconds. The panic vanished, buried beneath a masterful mask of wounded affection. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, looking at Maya with wide, innocent eyes. "Maya, baby," he said, his voice dripping with honeyed sincerity. You were not supposed to see that. You ruined the surprise. Maya frowned, her anger faltering just a fraction. What surprise? What are you talking about? Trent reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick paper. He smoothed it out on the table between them. It was a printed architectural blueprint, highly detailed and professional. I did not want to tell you until our wedding day, Trent murmured, reaching out to gently touch her hand. That text was from an architect. I know how much your father's old lake house means to you. I have been secretly working with a high-end design firm for the past month. I was planning to use my own savings to completely remodel the cabin to turn it into a modern luxury retreat for us to start our family. It was going to be my wedding gift to you. I watched as my brilliant, intelligent daughter crumbled. The anger melted from her face, replaced instantly by overwhelming guilt and tears. "Oh my God, Trent," she whispered, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry for doubting you." He reached across the table, taking both of her hands in his, playing the benevolent, forgiving saint. "It is okay, darling. I know I have been secretive lately. I just wanted it to be absolutely perfect for you and for our future. It was a beautiful performance. Truly flawless. There was only one problem. It was a complete and utter lie." I sat there swirling the amber liquid in my glass, keeping my face entirely blank. I knew Trent was lying because the lake house he claimed to be remodeling was located in a county that had passed strict conservation zoning laws just last year. It was legally impossible to get permits to alter, expand, or remodel any structure on that specific coastline. No legitimate architect would draft blueprints for a remodel there because no remodel was legally permitted by the state. Trent was feeding my daughter a fairy tale to cover his tracks, and she was eating it right out of his hands. I did not expose him. Not then. If you want to trap a rat, you do not yell at it when it sniffs the cheese. You let it walk all the way into the cage. A few minutes later, Trent excused himself to go to the restroom, deliberately leaving his phone on the table to prove to Maya that he had absolutely nothing to hide. He was arrogant, overconfident in his ability to manipulate the woman who loved him. While Maya turned her attention to the waiter to ask for a dessert menu, I leaned forward slightly. I did not touch his phone. I just looked down at the illuminated screen. The notification he had tried to pass off as a message from an architect was still visible on the lock screen. The sender was not an architectural firm. The contact name was saved simply as Viper Real Estate. Viper Real Estate. I memorized the name, searing it into my mind. Legitimate real estate agents do not text their clients at 9 o'clock at night on a Friday unless it is something urgent, illicit, or desperate. When the dinner finally ended, Trent paid the exorbitant bill with a flashy gold credit card, puffing his chest out as he helped Maya with her coat. He looked at me, giving me that same condescending, victorious smirk. "Great evening, Monroe. We will have to discuss that lake house more in depth soon." "Take your time, Trent," I replied, my voice smooth and completely devoid of emotion. "We have all the time in the world." As they walked ahead toward the valet stand, I hung back near the coat check. I pulled out my own phone, an old simple model that people like Trent constantly underestimated, and dialed a number I had not used in 5 years. It belonged to an old friend, a ruthless private investigator who used to handle corporate espionage for my logistics empire. He answered on the second ring. "I need a deep dive on a man named Trent Caldwell," I whispered into the receiver, watching through the glass doors as Trent wrapped his arm possessively around my daughter's waist. "I want his financials, his hidden assets, his associates, and I need an immediate trace on a phone number linked to a contact called Viper Real Estate. Dig up everything. I think my future son-in-law is a dead man, walking." 2 days later, I found myself standing in the foyer of a luxury penthouse in downtown Chicago. Trent had rented this place to show off his supposed wealth. The ceilings were high. The furniture was modern and cold. Everything looked expensive but felt entirely fake, just like the man who rented it. Maya held my arm as we stepped inside. She wore a simple blue dress, looking beautiful and hopeful. I wore a plain beige suit. I deliberately chose a suit that looked a little worn around the edges. When you are going to war, you do not let the enemy see your armor. You let them see exactly what they expect to see. A weak old man. Trent greeted us at the door holding a glass of whiskey. He smiled that same arrogant smile. Right behind him stood his parents, Richard and Susan Caldwell. They were the kind of people who wore their supposed superiority like a cheap cologne. Richard was a tall man with silver hair and a tailored golf jacket. Susan wore too much jewelry and had a tight smile that never reached her eyes. They looked us up and down the moment we walked in. I saw the judgment in their eyes. They saw a black man from the South Side and a daughter who they believed was punching above her weight. Susan stepped forward and extended a stiff hand toward Maya. "Maya, darling," she said in a voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You look so lovely. We were just telling Trent how lucky you are to be joining our family. It is quite a step up for you. We are so thrilled to bring someone from your background into a family with our pedigree." The racial coding in her words was so loud it could have shattered the glass windows. Pedigree. Background. Lucky. Maya shifted uncomfortably but smiled politely to keep the peace. I just watched them. I did not say a word. I let my silence fill the room. Richard turned to me. He did not offer his hand. He just gave me a stiff nod. "Monroe," he said, "Trent tells me you used to fix trucks for a living. That is honest work, hard work. I admire people who work with their hands. It keeps things simple. Our family has always been in finance and wealth management. It is a different world entirely, a very complex world." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression blank. "It sure is a complex world, Richard," I replied softly. "I just put the engines together. I leave the big thinking to folks like you." Trent laughed and patted his father's shoulder. "See, Dad? I told you Monroe was a practical guy. No nonsense. Come on, let us sit down in the living room. I have some vintage scotch to pour." We moved to the living room. The view of the Chicago skyline was spectacular, but the atmosphere inside was suffocating. The penthouse was a masterclass in deception. There were expensive abstract paintings on the walls that looked like they had been rented by the hour. The champagne flutes were crystal, but the tension in the room was as cheap as dirt. Trent handed me a glass of scotch. I took it, but did not drink. I never drink when I am working, and right now I was working. I was studying my targets. Susan sat perfectly straight on the white leather sofa, crossing her legs. She looked at Maya. "You know, Maya, marriage is not just about love. It is about merging legacies. The Caldwell family has a long history of financial literacy. We know how to protect our assets and grow our wealth for the next generation. Trent is a mastermind at this. We want to make sure you are fully integrated into our way of doing things. You will not have to worry about a single financial decision. Trent will handle it all." Maya looked at Trent with trusting eyes. Trent smiled back like a benevolent king. "I know, Mrs. Caldwell," Maya said softly. "Trent has been so helpful. I am just focused on my patients at the hospital. Finance is not my strong suit." Richard seized the opening immediately. "Exactly," my dear Richard said, setting his glass down on the glass table with a sharp clink. "And that brings us to an important piece of family business." Richard reached into his leather briefcase resting beside the sofa. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a blue folder. He slid the folder across the coffee table toward Maya and me. "This is a prenuptial agreement," Richard announced. His tone was authoritative, as if he were giving orders to an employee. "It is standard procedure in our family. It protects the young couple's starting assets and ensures that generational wealth is properly managed." Maya blinked in surprise. "A prenup? Trent, we never talked about this." Trent reached out and squeezed her hand. "It is just a formality, baby. My parents insisted. It is just to make sure we start our marriage with complete financial transparency. It protects both of us." I looked at the thick stack of papers. Then I looked at Richard. "What exactly does this document do?" Richard I asked, keeping my voice raspy and uncertain. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at me with pure condescension. "Well, Monroe, it does a few things. But there is one specific clause we need your blessing on. Trent mentioned that you own a wooden cabin up on Lake Michigan. He said you have been struggling to pay the property taxes on it. I had never struggled to pay a tax bill in my life. But Trent had clearly painted me as a broke old man drowning in expenses. We want to relieve you of that burden," Richard continued. "The prenup includes a clause where you sign over the deed to the lake house directly to Trent, not to Maya, to Trent. He will assume full legal ownership before the wedding. This way he can use his financial expertise to leverage the property. He can take out loans against it to build a proper investment portfolio for their future." Susan chimed in immediately. "It really is the best solution, Monroe. Real estate law is incredibly complicated. It is not something a retired mechanic should have to stress over in his golden years. Let Trent manage the generational wealth. He understands these complex financial instruments. You can just relax and enjoy your retirement." I looked down at the blue folder. They were trying to steal my property right in front of my face, and they were wrapping it up in a bow of charity. They thought I was a naive fool who would just hand over a piece of land to a man I barely knew. Trent leaned back in his chair, watching me closely. "It is for the best, Monroe. I promise I will take good care of the place. I will turn it into something valuable." I kept my head down. I let my shoulders slump. I made my breathing sound heavy and tired. I acted exactly like a defeated old man who was in way over his head. "You know," I murmured, staring at the carpet, "that old cabin has been in my name for a long time. My late wife loved the view of the water." I let the silence hang. Inside my mind, a cold, calculating fire was burning. They thought that lake house was just a run-down shack worth maybe $500,000. They thought it was a cheap asset they could quickly flip for some cash. They had absolutely no idea about the reality of that land. 10 years ago, I bought that specific plot because I knew the city council was planning a long-term expansion project. That rundown wooden cabin sits directly on top of a massive commercial rezoning plot. Last month, the city officially approved the expansion. The state is preparing to offer a mandatory buyout to build a new commercial transit hub. That land is not worth $500,000. It was recently appraised at $12 million. And these arrogant fake aristocrats were trying to steal $12 million from my family while smiling in my face and insulting my intelligence. I slowly reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the blue folder toward me. I did not open it. I just held it gently against my chest. "This is a lot of legal talk for an old man," I said, my voice cracking perfectly. "I do not understand all these big words about portfolios and assets. I need to take this home. I need to read it over slowly with my reading glasses." Richard frowned, clearly annoyed by the delay. "Monroe, this is a very standard contract. There is no need to delay. You can just sign the back page now and we can handle the notary tomorrow." I shook my head stubbornly, clutching the folder tighter. "No, Richard. My wife always told me never to sign a paper without putting my glasses on first. I will take it home. I will read it tonight." Trent sighed but gave his father a subtle nod. "It is fine, Dad. Let him read it." He turned to me with a reassuring smile. "Take your time, Monroe. But please remember the wedding is coming up fast. We need this finalized soon. I will not keep you waiting." "Trent," I promised. I stood up slowly, pretending my knees were stiff. "Come on, Maya. Let us go home and let these fine people get back to their evening." Maya looked confused and hurt by the whole ambush, but she stood up and followed me to the door. We said our polite goodbyes. Susan gave Maya another fake smile. Richard gave me another stiff nod. Trent watched us leave with a look of absolute triumph in his eyes. We took the elevator down in silence. Maya squeezed my arm. "Dad, I am so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea they were going to ask for the house. You do not have to sign anything. I will talk to Trent." "Do not worry about it, baby girl," I said, patting her hand. "Your old man knows exactly what he is doing." We walked out of the luxury building into the cool Chicago night air. I put Maya into a waiting taxi and told her I would take the next one. As her car drove away, I stood alone on the pavement. The act was over. My shoulders straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished. The tired old man disappeared, leaving only the ruthless tycoon who had crushed men twice as smart as Trent Caldwell. From the shadows of the alley, a figure stepped out. It was my private investigator. He wore a dark coat and a flat cap. He walked up to me without a word and handed me a thick, sealed manila envelope. "Is it all in here?" I asked, my voice hard and sharp. "Every dirty secret they have," the investigator replied. "The Caldwell family is not who they claim to be, Monroe. You are going to want to read this immediately." I took the heavy envelope. I looked back up at the glowing windows of the penthouse. Trent Caldwell and his parents thought they had cornered a helpless victim. They had no idea they had just stepped into a slaughterhouse. I walked into my home office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. This room was my sanctuary. It was the only place where I did not have to pretend to be a tired old mechanic from the South Side. The walls were lined with leather-bound ledgers and operational maps from my logistics company. There were no rented abstract paintings here. There were only the solid realities of 40 years of relentless hard work. I sat behind my solid mahogany desk and turned on the small brass reading lamp. The warm light spilled across the smooth wood surface. I placed the thick manila envelope that my private investigator had given me right in the center of the desk. My investigator never handed me a file this thick unless he had uncovered a mountain of absolute filth. I picked up a silver letter opener and smoothly sliced the top of the envelope. I tipped it over and a massive stack of papers spilled out onto the desk. I took a deep breath and began to read. I have spent my entire life reading contracts and balance sheets. I know how to spot a bad investment from a mile away. The very first document was a comprehensive background check from the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. I read the executive summary and felt a cold and bitter smile form on my face. Trent Caldwell was not an elite financial advisor. He was a complete fraud. His broker license had been permanently revoked 3 years ago for highly unethical practices and the gross misappropriation of client funds. He was not managing generational wealth for any high society families. He was not managing anything legitimate at all. I turned to the next section of the file, which contained a series of leaked bank records and offshore wire transfer logs. It did not take a financial genius to see what Trent was actually doing. He was running a classic Ponzi scheme. He was taking money from new investors to pay off the old ones just to maintain his pathetic illusion of success. But the documents showed that his scheme was rapidly collapsing. The spreadsheets were bleeding red ink. Trent was facing a massive cash deficit. He was desperate. And when fake aristocrats get desperate, they turn to the worst possible people for a bailout. The file contained several grainy surveillance photographs. The images showed Trent meeting with known associates of a ruthless Chicago crime syndicate in a dimly lit parking garage. He was in deep with the mob. According to my investigators' notes, Trent owed these criminals $4 million. The mob does not send polite collection letters. They send enforcers. They break legs, and they take lives. Trent was a trapped rat with a ticking clock suspended over his head. He needed cash immediately to save his own life. That was why he was pushing so hard for a quick wedding. That was why he wanted my lake house. He intended to liquidate my $12 million property the moment the ink was dry on that prenuptial agreement just to pay off his underworld debts. I set the photographs aside and picked up the next folder. It contained the complete financial history of Richard and Susan Caldwell. These were the arrogant people who had stood in their penthouse just a few hours earlier insulting my background and demanding my property. They had looked down their noses at my daughter and spoken about their superior pedigree. The truth buried in these government documents was absolutely pathetic. The file contained federal bankruptcy court records from exactly 5 years ago. Richard and Susan Caldwell were completely broke. Their luxurious downtown penthouse was a short-term rental. Their country club memberships, their tailored golf jackets, and their expensive scotch were all funded entirely by the stolen money from Trent's collapsing Ponzi scheme. They were living off the blood and sweat of innocent people. They were parasites hiding behind a thin veil of white privilege. They needed Maya and my real estate because they were drowning in a sea of debt and lies. They had zero assets to their name. The entire family was a mirage. I kept flipping through the pages, feeling a quiet satisfaction that I had seen right through their act. But then I reached the final section of the file, and my heart completely stopped. I stared at a set of loan applications that made my blood run ice cold. They were commercial bridge loans taken out with a predatory lending firm over the last 2 months. The total amount borrowed was $200,000. But Trent had not used his own name to secure these loans. He had used Maya's name. I looked closer at the digital signatures on the documents. Trent had stolen my daughter's social security number. He had likely taken it from a background check when they applied for their shared apartment. He had forged her signature on multiple federal financial documents. He was securing high-interest loans under her identity to funnel emergency cash to his mob creditors. He was not just marrying her to steal my money. He was using my brilliant and innocent daughter as a financial human shield. I realized the full depth of his dark plan. When his Ponzi scheme inevitably collapsed, the federal authorities would come looking for the money. The paper trail for these fraudulent bridge loans led directly to Maya. Trent and his parents were setting her up to take the fall. If the scheme went down, Maya would be the one facing federal fraud charges. Maya would be the one losing her medical license and going to federal prison while Trent and his fake aristocratic parents vanished with whatever cash they had left. I sat in the silent room staring at the forged signature of my only child. A dark and violent rage washed over me. It was not a loud, explosive anger. It was a cold, calculating fury. I had spent 40 years building a legacy to protect my daughter. I had crushed ruthless competitors and navigated the most unforgiving business environments in the city of Chicago just so she would never have to struggle. Now a pathetic con artist was trying to destroy her entire life to save his own skin. Trent Caldwell thought he was a mastermind playing a foolish and uneducated old black man. He had no idea that he had just declared war on a man who knew how to dismantle an entire corporation piece by piece. I was not just going to stop the wedding. That would be too easy. I was going to ruin his life completely. I was going to let him fall directly into the hands of the syndicate he owed $4 million to. I was going to strip away every single ounce of his false dignity and watch him beg for mercy. I began to organize the documents on my desk, plotting the exact sequence of my counterattack. I knew exactly which of my corporate lawyers to call first. I knew exactly how to set the trap. As I was forming the steps of my plan, my personal phone began to vibrate violently on the polished mahogany desk. The sudden noise broke the heavy silence of the office. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was very late. My private investigator was usually the only person who called me at this hour. I looked down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed Maya's name. I answered the phone immediately, expecting her to tell me she was safely back at her apartment and ready to sleep. Instead, I heard the chaotic background noise of medical machines beeping and the echoing sounds of a busy hallway. Maya was crying. Her voice was shaking so violently I could barely understand her words. I sat up straight, gripping the phone tightly. I asked her where she was and what was happening. She took a ragged, desperate breath and told me she was at the hospital. She had collapsed in her apartment shortly after returning from the dinner. My chest tightened with a sudden paralyzing fear. It was a terror I had not felt since the night my wife passed away. The anger I felt toward Trent vanished for a moment, replaced entirely by pure fatherly panic. I asked her what the emergency room doctors had said. I asked her if she was hurt. I could hear her trying to steady her breathing over the phone. She told me she was not hurt, but her blood pressure had spiked dangerously high, causing her to faint. She paused for a long second. The silence on the line felt like an eternity. Then, with a voice full of fear and confusion, she told me she was pregnant. I drove through the empty streets of Chicago like a madman. The streetlights blurred into streaks of yellow and red as my car tore through the night. My heart pounded a relentless rhythm against my ribs. Maya was in the hospital. My brilliant and strong daughter had collapsed. When I finally burst through the sliding doors of the emergency room, the clinical smell of antiseptic hit me like a physical blow. I found her in a private room on the 3rd floor. She was sitting up in the pale hospital bed, wearing a thin gown. Her face was exhausted, but when she looked at me, she had a smile that completely broke my heart. She told me the doctors had managed to stabilize her blood pressure. Then she grabbed my hand and told me the news again, just to make it real. She was going to be a mother. I was going to be a grandfather. I hugged her tightly, feeling the fragile tremble of her shoulders. But as I held my daughter, the attending physician pulled me aside into the quiet hallway. The doctor looked incredibly grim. He told me that Maya was facing a highly dangerous, high-risk pregnancy. Her blood pressure was incredibly volatile and unpredictable. The doctor looked me directly in the eyes and gave me a strict medical warning. He said any severe emotional distress or sudden shock could trigger a catastrophic spike in her blood pressure, a spike that could easily lead to a miscarriage or even endanger Maya's own life. I stood in the sterile white hallway clutching the leather handle of my briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the thick manila folder containing every piece of evidence against Trent Caldwell. I had the proof of his Ponzi scheme. I had the proof of his mob debts. I had the proof that he had stolen her identity to take out fraudulent loans. But I could not show it to her. If I walked into that room and told my pregnant daughter that the man she loved was a predatory criminal, it would shatter her entire world. The shock could kill my unborn grandchild. It could kill Maya. I realized in that quiet, suffocating moment that I was completely trapped. I could not simply expose Trent and let the chips fall where they may. I had to dismantle him in absolute silence. I had to create a situation where Trent would walk away voluntarily or be destroyed by his own actions without Maya ever knowing the horrific truth until it was entirely safe. I told Maya to get some rest and promised I would be right back. I walked down to the hospital parking garage. The concrete structure was cold and dimly lit. My private investigator was waiting for me, leaning against the hood of his dark sedan. I walked up to him, and he did not waste any time with pleasantries. He handed me a secure digital tablet and told me he had cracked the phone number for Viper Real Estate. I looked at the glowing screen. A surveillance photograph of a woman appeared. She was white, maybe 20-something years old, with blonde hair and a sharp, calculating face. Her name was Chloe. She was not a real estate agent. According to my investigator, Chloe was a highly sophisticated money launderer who operated in the dark shadows of the Chicago financial district. And she was Trent Caldwell's actual mistress. They had been intimately involved for 3 years, long before Trent ever met my daughter. Trent did not love Maya. He never had. Maya was nothing but a high-value target to them. She was a wealthy, successful black woman with pristine credit and a rich father. To Trent and Chloe, my family was just a bank waiting to be robbed blind. My investigator pressed a button on the tablet. He told me he had managed to clone the audio from a surveillance bug he had slipped into Trent's luxury car during the engagement dinner. I put the earpiece in and listened. The audio was crisp and clear. I heard the sound of Trent's car engine humming and the noise of city traffic in the background. Then I heard Trent speaking. His voice was no longer smooth or aristocratic. It was frantic, cruel, and dripping with condescension. He was talking to Chloe on speakerphone. I heard Chloe ask him how the dinner went. She sounded impatient and greedy. Trent laughed, a nasty, arrogant sound. He told her the old man was a complete idiot. He said I was just an uneducated grease monkey holding onto a gold mine, and that I was too foolish to know what to do with it. Then they started discussing the actual plan. My blood turned to absolute ice as I listened to the monstrous depths of their greed. Trent explained that the wedding needed to happen as fast as possible. He told Chloe about the $12 million lake house. He said once they were legally married, he would force Maya to convince me to sign the deed over completely to him. Once he had the deed, he was going to liquidate the property to a commercial developer behind our backs. He was going to take the $12 million and immediately pay off the $4 million he owed to the Chicago crime syndicate. But that was not even the worst part. Chloe asked him what they were going to do about the $200,000 in fraudulent bridge loans Trent had taken out using Maya's social security number. Trent's answer made me want to hunt him down and end his life right then and there. He told Chloe they were going to take the rest of the lake house money and flee to Europe to live like royalty. He said when his Ponzi scheme inevitably crashed, the federal agents would trace the bridge loans directly to Maya. Trent laughed a cold, heartless laugh as he said it. He said Maya was the perfect fall guy. She was a doctor making good money. The authorities would easily believe she was the one committing fraud to fund a lavish lifestyle. Trent and Chloe were actively plotting to send my pregnant daughter to a federal penitentiary while they escaped with my hard-earned money. The audio recording ended with the sound of Trent and Chloe making kiss noises over the phone. I handed the tablet back to my investigator. My hands were no longer shaking. The panic I had felt earlier upstairs in the maternity ward was entirely gone. It was replaced by a dark, terrifying calm. Trent Caldwell was planning to destroy my family. He was planning to leave my daughter to rot in a prison cell while she carried his child. He thought he was playing a simple game of chess with a foolish old man. He did not realize he had just stepped into a war zone. I thanked my investigator and told him to keep tracking every single move Trent made. I walked back toward the hospital elevator. My mind was calculating 1,000 different moves. I could not simply eliminate Trent with violence. That would bring police to my door and ruin Maya's peace. I had to be smarter and much more ruthless. I had to use Trent's own massive ego against him. I had to build a trap so perfectly disguised as a financial gift that he would gladly walk right into it. I was going to use his unbelievable greed to dig his own grave. I rode the elevator back up to the 3rd floor. As I stepped out into the bright hallway, I saw a figure hurrying toward Maya's room. It was Trent. He was wearing a fresh tailored suit and holding a massive bouquet of expensive white roses. He had customized his face to look like the perfect worried fiancé. He saw me and immediately put on a mask of deep emotional concern. "Monroe," he said, rushing up to me with wide, fake eyes. "I came as soon as Maya called. Is she okay? Is our baby okay?" I was so terrified. He was a spectacular actor. If I had not heard that audio recording just 5 minutes ago, I might have believed the absolute panic in his pale eyes. I looked at the man who was planning to send my daughter to a federal prison. I looked at the man who was planning to steal $12 million from my family and leave us with nothing but shame. I did not punch him. I did not scream or raise my voice. I reached out and took his hand. I gripped his hand firmly and smiled. It was a cold, dead smile that did not reach my eyes. "Maya is resting Trent," I said smoothly. "The doctor says she needs absolute peace and zero stress. You and I are going to make sure she gets exactly what she needs. We are going to protect her future together." Trent smiled back, squeezing my hand tightly. Absolutely, Monroe. I promise you I will take care of everything. He walked past me into the hospital room holding his white roses like a trophy. I stood in the quiet hallway looking at my own hand. Trent Caldwell had no idea. He thought he was walking in to comfort his future wife and secure his massive payday. He did not know he had just shaken hands with the man who was going to bury him alive in a mountain of debt and federal charges. I was shaking hands with a dead man walking. 2 days after the terrifying hospital visit, Trent Caldwell showed up at my front door unannounced. He did not call ahead to check if I was busy. He simply parked his leased German sports car in my driveway and walked up the concrete steps of my brick house on the south side of Chicago. I watched him approach through the sheer curtains of my living room window. He was trying his best to look casual and confident, but his movements were jerky and rushed. The invisible ticking clock of the Chicago crime syndicate was hanging heavily over his head. My private investigator had confirmed that the mob had given Trent a strict deadline to pay back the $4 million he owed them. He was utterly desperate to get his hands on the deed to my $12 million lake house. He thought he was walking into the humble home of a tired, uneducated old man. He did not realize he was walking straight into a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. I opened the heavy wooden door before he could even ring the bell. I wore a faded flannel shirt and old denim jeans, playing the exact part of the simple mechanic he believed me to be. Trent smiled his fake aristocrat smile and held up a brown leather folder. He politely asked if he could come inside to discuss some urgent family business. I stepped aside slowly and let the vampire cross the threshold into my home. We sat down across from each other at my solid oak kitchen table. Trent did not waste any time with small talk. He opened the leather folder and slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood toward me. He leaned forward and put on his very best performance of a deeply concerned father-to-be. He told me that seeing Maya collapse and end up in the hospital had really scared him. He said her high-risk pregnancy meant she needed absolute peace and quiet away from any financial burdens. He told me that the stress of wedding planning and managing complicated family assets was simply too much for her fragile medical condition. He smoothly suggested that I sign the deed to the lake house over to him right now so he could take the financial weight completely off her shoulders. He said he wanted to secure the starting assets for his new baby before the wedding ceremony took place. It was a masterful and disgusting manipulation. He was using the health of my unborn grandchild as emotional leverage to steal my property. I looked down at the papers. I let my shoulders slump forward, making myself look small and entirely overwhelmed by the situation. I picked up my cheap reading glasses with a trembling hand and slowly put them on my face. I squinted at the documents, pretending to be completely baffled by the dense legal terminology. I sighed heavily and rubbed my tired eyes for dramatic effect. I told Trent that all these big corporate words confused my old brain. I told him I was terrified of the government and the tax authorities. I spun a long, detailed story about a fictional friend of mine who lost his entire auto shop because the federal tax agencies came after him for a simple paperwork mistake. I acted completely financially illiterate. I told Trent I was terrified that if we transferred a property this big, the government would come knocking and demand massive taxes that we could not pay. I said I was absolutely terrified they would audit Maya and ruin her prestigious medical license. I told him I could never forgive myself if my daughter went to a federal prison over a tax mistake on an old wooden cabin. I leaned across the table and lowered my voice like I was sharing a dark and dangerous secret. I told Trent that I had been talking to some old buddies down at the local auto shop. I told him they mentioned something called an LLC. I butchered the pronunciation of the acronym on purpose to make myself sound even more ignorant and out of my depth. I said I heard that if you put a house inside a company, the government cannot easily touch your personal money. I looked at Trent with wide, trusting eyes. I suggested that we create one of those company things and put the lake house deed inside it. And then I delivered the ultimate bait. I told him I did not want Maya's name anywhere near this company just to be completely safe from the authorities. I said Trent should be the sole owner and the sole chief executive officer of the company, just him. No Maya and no me. I told him he was the educated white financial advisor, and he was the only one smart enough to handle the government and protect our family. I watched Trent Caldwell swallow the hook, line, and sinker, his pale eyes practically dilated with pure, unadulterated greed. He was trying so incredibly hard to hide his excitement, but his breathing hitched in his throat. In his arrogant mind, I had just handed him the absolute perfect scenario. If Maya was not on the paperwork, He would not even have to forge her signature or trick her into selling the property later. He would have 100% legal control of the $12 million asset the moment I signed. He could liquidate it the very next day, pay off his mob debts, and run away to Europe with his mistress Chloe without facing any legal hurdles from my family. He truly thought he was the smartest man in the entire world. He thought he had completely outplayed a senile old black man from the slums. Trent quickly reached across the table and patted my wrinkled hand. He told me I was a practical genius. He praised my street smarts and my protective instincts as a father. He said an LLC was the absolute best way to protect Maya and the new baby from any government interference. He eagerly agreed to be the sole signatory and the sole owner of the new shell company. He told me he would have his own elite downtown lawyers draw up the corporate paperwork immediately to get it done before the weekend. I shook my head stubbornly and refused. I told him I did not trust new fancy city lawyers who charged by the hour. I told him I had an old friend who handled cheap legal paperwork for my auto shop back in the day. I insisted that my guy do the paperwork so I could feel safe and understand what was happening. Trent chuckled softly and agreed without a fight. He thought my lawyer was just some cheap storefront amateur who would blindly follow basic instructions. He told me to get the papers ready as soon as possible because the wedding was only days away and the clock was ticking. Trent stood up and buttoned his tailored jacket. He looked around my modest kitchen feeling like a victorious conqueror who had just plundered a village. He promised me he would take care of everything and protect our family legacy forever. I walked him to the front door and watched him drive away in his loud sports car. The moment his car turned the corner at the end of the block, the tired old man posture completely vanished from my body. I stood up perfectly straight. My hands were steady and strong. My mind was sharp and vibrating with cold calculation. I went to my bedroom closet and put on a custom-tailored dark suit. I left my quiet house, got into my car, and drove straight into the beating heart of the Chicago financial district. I parked in the secure underground garage of a sleek, glass high-rise building. There were no signs on the heavy frosted glass door of the office I entered on the 45th floor. This was the highly classified headquarters of my underground corporate legal team. These were not cheap storefront lawyers. These were the ruthless legal sharks who had helped me build my massive logistics empire from the ground up over the last 40 years. These men and women were absolute predators in the courtroom and the boardroom. They specialized in hostile takeovers, corporate liquidations, and brutal financial warfare. I walked into the main conference room where the city skyline stretched out behind a massive mahogany table. My lead attorney, a man with cold, calculating eyes, handed me a glass of expensive bourbon. I did not sit down. I stood at the head of the long table and gave them their marching orders. I told them to create the Shell LLC for Trent Caldwell exactly as I had promised him. I told them to put the lake house deed inside the company and make Trent the sole executive officer with absolute control. But then I gave them the final lethal instruction. I told them to attach a cross-collateralization clause to the foundational charter of the LLC. I explained the brutal mechanism of the death trap to my team. Years ago, during a ruthless corporate expansion phase, I had acquired a failing shipping subsidiary. That defunct company was currently sitting on $15 million in unpaid federal tax liens and severe toxic debt owed directly to the Internal Revenue Service. I told my lawyers to legally fuse the new Lake House LLC with the toxic debt of that bankrupt shipping company. The legal trap was completely invisible to the untrained eye, but absolutely devastating in its financial execution. The cross-collateralization clause meant that the exact moment Trent signed the documents to become the owner of the Lake House LLC, he would simultaneously and legally assume personal responsibility for the $15 million federal tax debt. He thought he was rushing to sign a paper to steal $12 million from my family. He did not know he was actually rushing to sign a legally binding confession of debt to the United States government. I finished my bourbon and set the heavy crystal glass down on the table. My lead attorney smiled a dark, dangerous smile and assured me the paperwork would be utterly flawless. He said the trap would be buried deep under layers of dense corporate jargon that an arrogant fraud like Trent would never bother to read before signing. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Chicago skyline below me. Trent had a 48-hour deadline to pay the mob their $4 million. He was sprinting toward his own destruction, completely blinded by his own prejudice and overwhelming greed. I had built the perfect financial guillotine. Now all I had to do was wait for him to put his own head inside it and let gravity do the rest of the work. I stood at the head of the massive mahogany table in the glass-walled conference room. My legal team sat before me in absolute silence. These were not the kind of lawyers who argued over petty civil disputes or simple contracts. These were corporate assassins. I looked at Marcus, my lead attorney, and told him to explain the weapon we were building. Marcus opened a thick, leather-bound folder and laid out the exact blueprint for Trent Caldwell's destruction. 15 years ago, during a ruthless expansion of my logistics empire, I acquired a massive shipping subsidiary out of Detroit. The company was already failing when I bought it. I stripped it of its valuable assets, absorbed its fleet, and left the corporate shell to rot. That dead company was currently carrying $15 million in federal tax liens, unpayable penalties, and toxic corporate debt. It was a financial black hole. I had kept the shell company active for years, specifically for write-offs and aggressive legal maneuvering. Now it was going to serve a much darker purpose. Marcus explained the mechanism of the snare. We were going to create the new company for Trent just as I had promised him. We would title it something incredibly generic like Lakefront Holdings. We would transfer the deed of the $12 million lake house directly into this new entity. Trent would see that the property was legally secured. His overwhelming greed would blind him to everything else. But underneath the straightforward property transfer, Marcus had woven a masterpiece of legal sabotage. He used a brutal corporate tactic called cross-collateralization. Deep within the operating agreement, buried on page 47 of the dense legal text, was a corporate merger clause. The document stated that by signing as the sole owner and chief executive officer of Lakefront Holdings, the signatory was also executing a legally binding corporate merger with the defunct Detroit shipping subsidiary. The law is a fascinating and dangerous machine when you know how to wield it. The exact second Trent put his signature on that paper, he would not just be claiming ownership of a lake house. He would be legally assuming personal corporate liability for $15 million in federal tax debt. The Internal Revenue Service does not negotiate with shell companies. They freeze assets. They seize bank accounts. They destroy lives. By the time Trent tried to sell the lake house to pay off his underworld debts, the federal government would already have a massive lock on every single penny he possessed. He was trying to steal $12 million to save his own life. I was going to hand him a $15 million anchor and throw him into the deep end of the ocean. The very next morning, Trent called my personal phone. I let it ring 4 times before I answered, making my voice sound weak and confused. Trent sounded frantic. His tone was tight and completely breathless. He asked me if the paperwork was ready. He told me the wedding was rapidly approaching, and he wanted to surprise Maya with the completed property transfer before the ceremony. He suggested we sign the documents at the rehearsal dinner the following night. I knew exactly why he was pushing so hard. He did not care about surprising my daughter. He cared about his own survival. He needed the deed in his hands so he could show it to the crime syndicate as proof of payment. I played my part perfectly. I coughed weakly into the receiver and told him my old friend from the auto shop had finally finished drafting the papers. I complained about how thick the stack of papers was and how the legal jargon was giving me a terrible headache. I told him I would bring the documents to the rehearsal dinner, but I warned him that there were dozens of pages to read through. I asked him if he wanted his own lawyers to review them first. I knew he would refuse. I knew his arrogance would not allow it. Trent laughed over the phone. It was that same condescending, fake, aristocratic chuckle that made my blood boil. He told me not to worry about a thing, Monroe. He said he was a financial expert and he read complex contracts for breakfast. He promised me he would look them over himself and sign them right there at the dinner. He told me we did not need to involve any expensive city lawyers who would just slow down the process. I smiled a cold and empty smile in my quiet kitchen. I told him I trusted his big, educated brain to handle all the heavy lifting. I hung up the phone and looked at the massive stack of documents sitting on my kitchen counter. Marcus had intentionally printed the contract in a tiny font. He had filled the first 40 pages with the most boring, repetitive, and mind-numbing property laws imaginable. It was a psychological test. A man who respects the law reads every word. A desperate, arrogant fraud skimming for a payday skips straight to the signature line. Trent Caldwell possessed zero discipline. He was a cornered animal wearing a tailored suit. I knew for an absolute fact he would flip directly to the last page to secure his prize. I drove back toward my neighborhood, letting the reality of the situation settle into my bones. I thought about my daughter Maya working her grueling shifts at the hospital, unaware of the massive storm gathering around her. She was carrying my grandchild. She was bringing a new life into this world, while the man she trusted was actively digging her a grave. The rage I felt was a physical weight in my chest, but I forced myself to push it down. Emotion makes you careless. Cold logic is what wins wars. I had to remain entirely focused on the mechanics of the trap. When the federal government freezes an asset, they do not ask politely. They do not send warning letters. The automated systems of the Internal Revenue Service communicate directly with the national banking grid. The very second the digital ink dried on the corporate merger documents, Trent's entire financial existence would evaporate. His personal checking accounts would lock. His credit cards would be declined. The fraudulent bridge loans he had taken out using Maya's social security number would instantly trigger fraud alerts across the federal banking network. By tying his fate to my toxic shipping company, I was not just destroying his access to my lake house. I was actively setting the federal authorities loose on his entire illegal operation. I was weaponizing the United States government to do my dirty work for me. Later that afternoon, I drove to a quiet industrial park on the outskirts of the city. My private investigator was waiting for me in his unmarked vehicle. I climbed into the passenger seat, and he handed me a secure tablet. He did not look happy. He told me the situation had escalated significantly overnight. His surveillance team had intercepted a deeply disturbing phone call between Trent and a high-ranking enforcer for the Chicago crime syndicate. The audio file was short but incredibly violent. The enforcer did not make threats. He made promises. He told Trent that the patience of the organization had completely run out. The Ponzi scheme was entirely exposed within the criminal underworld, and they wanted their $4 million immediately. The investigator looked me dead in the eyes and delivered the final piece of the puzzle. He told me the enforcer had given Trent a strict 48-hour deadline. If the money was not wired into their offshore accounts by the deadline, they were going to make a brutal public example out of him. I calculated the timeline in my head. 48 hours aligned exactly with the evening of the wedding day. The stakes had just multiplied exponentially. Trent was not just fighting for a lavish lifestyle in Europe anymore. He was fighting to keep his heart beating inside his chest. He was going to walk into the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night completely blinded by absolute terror. He would sign anything I put in front of him if he thought it would save his life. I stepped out of the investigator's car and felt the freezing Chicago wind hit my face. The pieces were all falling into place with a terrifying precision. Trent and his racist, fake aristocrat parents thought they were orchestrating the perfect robbery. They thought they were going to ruin my brilliant pregnant daughter and leave me with nothing but shame. They thought their white privilege and their fake financial vocabulary made them invincible against a man who grew up with grease on his hands. They had no idea that they were dealing with a man who had built an empire by outsmarting predators far more dangerous than them. The cross-collateralization snare was set. The federal trap was loaded. The mob was holding the timer. All I had to do was hand Trent Caldwell a pen and let his own miserable greed do the rest of the work. The rehearsal dinner took place at the Oakbridge Country Club in the wealthy northern suburbs. It was the kind of elite establishment that did not explicitly state its exclusionary policies, but communicated them loudly through its staggering membership fees and legacy admission rules. Walking through the heavy oak doors felt like stepping back in time to an era where men who looked like me were only allowed inside if they were carrying trays of food or opening car doors. The walls were lined with massive oil paintings of stern-looking white men riding horses and sailing yachts. The chandeliers hung low, casting a golden hue over the polished marble floors and the incredibly arrogant guests. I wore my tailored dark suit but kept my posture slightly stooped. I was playing the part of the tired mechanic who was completely out of his element in this world of old money and generational wealth. Maya walked beside me wearing a flowing emerald green dress that carefully concealed the early signs of her pregnancy. She looked exhausted, but she forced a bright smile for the sake of the evening. Trent was waiting for us in the grand dining hall holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne. He looked absolutely elated. He thought this was his coronation. He thought he was just hours away from securing a $12 million payday that would save him from the ruthless Chicago crime syndicate. Trent rushed over to greet us, kissing Maya on the cheek with a sickening display of fake affection. Then he turned to me and enthusiastically shook my hand. He told me he had arranged a private room for us to handle the paperwork before the main dinner began. He said he wanted to get the boring legal details out of the way so we could all just celebrate and focus on the family. As we walked into this private study, I noticed a young blonde woman standing by the fireplace holding a sleek leather briefcase. Trent smiled broadly and introduced her to Maya and me. He said her name was Chloe, and he described her as his elite financial assistant. He claimed she was there to ensure the limited liability company documents were filed correctly with the state first thing in the morning. I looked directly into Chloe's eyes and felt a massive surge of cold fury deep in my chest. I recognized her immediately from the surveillance photographs my private investigator had provided. This was not a financial assistant. This was the money launderer. This was the woman Trent had been sleeping with for 3 years. The sheer audacity of bringing his mistress to his own rehearsal dinner was staggering. They were so incredibly confident in their deception that they were rubbing it directly in our faces. Chloe offered me a tight professional smile and handed Trent a thick stack of papers from her briefcase. I kept my face completely blank. I acted like a confused old man who was just grateful for the help. I did not let them see the absolute predator lurking behind my tired eyes. We sat down around a heavy antique mahogany table. Trent spread the documents out in front of me with eager, trembling hands. He pointed to the areas where my signature was required to transfer the deed of the lake house into the new shell company. He spoke very quickly, using complicated financial vocabulary, trying to overwhelm me. He explained how this new company would protect Maya from heavy taxes and secure our family legacy for generations to come. I nodded slowly, taking my time. I pulled my cheap reading glasses from my pocket and put them on. I pretended to struggle with the small print, sighing heavily. I told Trent that I trusted his big, educated brain to make sure everything was correct. I asked him if he was absolutely certain that his name was the only one listed as the chief executive officer of the company. Trent eagerly nodded his head up and down. He pointed to the final page, showing me that Maya was completely excluded from the ownership structure, just as I had requested. He could barely contain his raw excitement. His hands were actually shaking as he handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. I slowly signed my name on the transfer deed, officially moving the $12 million property into the shell company. Then Trent grabbed the pen. He did not read a single page of the 40-page operating agreement. He did not read the dense legal jargon my corporate lawyers had buried in the middle of the contract. He simply flipped to the final signature line and signed his name with a massive, triumphant flourish. He had no idea that he had just legally assumed $15 million in toxic federal tax debt. He thought he was a newly minted millionaire. In reality, he was financially dead. With the papers signed, Trent handed the folder back to Chloe and told her to file them electronically first thing in the morning. We returned to the grand dining hall to join the rest of the guests. The Caldwell family had invited dozens of their fake aristocratic friends. The room was filled with the clinking of crystal glasses and the loud, arrogant laughter of people who falsely believed they owned the world. I sat quietly at the head table, watching the performance unfold. Richard Caldwell was drinking heavily. He was knocking back glass after glass of expensive scotch funded entirely by his son's collapsing Ponzi scheme. As the evening wore on, Richard grew louder and much more aggressive. When Maya stepped away to use the restroom, Richard stumbled over to my side of the table. His face was flushed red and his breath smelled heavily of liquor and cigars. He leaned in close to me, invading my personal space. He placed a heavy, sweaty hand on my shoulder and squeezed it tightly. Richard looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You did good for a guy from the slums, Monroe." He slurred, his voice low and dripping with venom. "You made some money fixing trucks and you bought your daughter a nice life. But you need to step aside now. Let educated white men manage Maya's wealth. She needs a real man to secure her future, not a grease monkey from the South Side. You have no place in our world, Monroe. Just hand over the keys and fade into the background where you belong." I did not react to his vile words. I did not raise my voice or push his heavy hand away. I simply looked at him with a calm, steady gaze. My phone was resting safely in the breast pocket of my suit jacket. The recording application had been running silently since the moment Richard walked over. Every single racist, classist, and arrogant word he just spoke was perfectly captured in high-definition audio. I smiled a cold, empty smile and reached for my glass of sparkling water. I raised my glass to Richard in a silent toast. "You have made yourself perfectly clear, Richard," I said softly. "I will make sure your family gets exactly what they deserve tomorrow." Richard smirked, thinking I was submitting to his authority. He patted my shoulder again and stumbled back to the bar to pour himself another drink. I stood up from the table and quietly excused myself from the dining hall. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the men's restroom. The heavy wooden door closed behind me, blocking out the sounds of the lavish party. I stood alone in the marble bathroom staring at my reflection in the gilded mirror. The time for playing the tired old man was completely over. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a cheap disposable burner phone that my private investigator had provided. It was completely untraceable. I opened a new text message and typed in a highly secure number belonging to a senior enforcer of the Chicago crime syndicate. Trent owed them $4 million and his 48-hour deadline expired tomorrow. I typed a very simple message. I gave them the exact address of the wedding venue, the start time of the ceremony, and the specific suite number where Trent Caldwell would be getting ready. I hit send and watched the message vanish into the digital ether. I dropped the burner phone into the trash can and washed my hands. The trap was fully primed. Tomorrow, Trent Caldwell would burn. The morning of the wedding arrived with a bright and deceptive sunshine over the city of Chicago. The sky was a crisp and clear blue without a single cloud in sight. It looked like the absolute perfect day for a grand celebration of love and family. But I knew the cold truth. It was a perfect day for a financial execution. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my quiet home and slowly adjusted the collar of my custom-tailored black tuxedo. I did not feel the usual, overwhelming joy that a father is supposed to feel on the day he gives his only daughter away to the man of her dreams. I felt the steady and calculated heartbeat of a soldier walking into a final battle. I drove my car to the luxury downtown hotel where the massive ceremony was taking place. The grand halls were filled with busy caterers carrying heavy silver trays and stressed florists arranging massive walls of expensive white roses. I ignored all the beautiful chaos and walked directly to the bridal suite on the second floor. When I opened the heavy wooden door, my breath completely caught in my throat. Maya was standing on a small velvet pedestal looking absolutely breathtaking in a flowing white silk wedding dress. Her smile was radiant and full of pure hope. She touched her stomach very gently, protecting the tiny, fragile life growing inside her. She looked at me with tears of pure happiness shining in her dark eyes. She thanked me for everything I had done to make this beautiful day possible. I walked over and hugged my daughter very tightly. I closed my eyes and silently promised her that she would never have to shed a single tear over the deceitful man waiting down the hall. I was going to absorb all the pain and all the ugliness of this situation so she could remain completely untouched and safe. I kissed her forehead and told her I would see her at the altar. Down the long carpeted hallway, in the extravagant groom's suite, Trent Caldwell was living in a complete fantasy world. My private investigator had slipped into the hotel early that morning and placed a small audio bug behind a painting in the room so I could monitor every single movement. Trent was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, holding a heavy crystal glass of very expensive vintage champagne. He was laughing loudly with his arrogant father, Richard. They were openly celebrating a massive financial victory they had not even achieved yet. Trent was bragging about his own superior genius. He boasted to his father about how incredibly easy it had been to manipulate a tired old black man from the South Side. He told Richard that the $12 million lake house was basically already sitting safely in his pocket. But beneath that loud, arrogant laughter, I could hear the sharp and frantic edge of pure terror in his voice. Trent kept checking the heavy gold watch on his wrist every 2 minutes. He was sweating right through his expensive white dress shirt. The ruthless Chicago crime syndicate had given him a strict 48-hour deadline to pay back the $4 million he had stolen to fund his collapsing Ponzi scheme. That lethal deadline was going to expire in exactly 4 hours. Trent was a cornered and desperate animal. He needed the deed to my property immediately so he could wire the funds to the mob and save his own life. He was completely blinded by his overwhelming desperation and his massive ego. I stepped out of the bridal suite and walked down to a quiet, isolated corner of the hotel lobby. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to my lead corporate attorney waiting on standby. The message simply told him to release the bait. 10 minutes later, a professional courier wearing a dark gray suit arrived at the heavy double doors of the groom's suite. He knocked firmly and handed Trent a thick sealed envelope stamped with a fake but highly official-looking legal seal. Trent practically ripped the heavy envelope right out of the courier's hands. He tore the thick paper open and pulled out the finalized documents for the limited liability company. This was the exact trap my corporate legal sharks had built from scratch. The front page clearly stated in bold letters that Trent Caldwell was being officially named the sole owner and chief executive officer of Lakefront Holdings. The document promised him absolute and unchecked control over the $12 million property. There was no mention of Maya anywhere on the paperwork. There was no mention of me. It looked like the absolute perfect crime handed to him on a silver platter. Through the audio bug, I heard Richard Caldwell look over his son's shoulder. Richard told Trent to call their family lawyer to review the contract right now. Richard said it was standard operating procedure for educated men to have a professional read the fine print before signing any major corporate transfer. But Trent violently shook his head, rejecting the advice. He was breathing very heavily, his eyes darting back and forth across the front page of the contract. He told his father there was absolutely no time for lawyers to get involved. He said the old mechanic had probably used some cheap storefront attorney, and the paperwork was completely standard and harmless. Trent argued that if they delayed the signing by even an hour, the old man might change his mind or get confused and ruin the entire massive deal. The brutal truth was that Trent knew the mob was breathing right down his neck. If he waited for a lawyer to carefully read all 40 pages of the dense corporate jargon, he might miss his deadline and end up dead in a dark alley before the sun went down. His overwhelming greed and his paralyzing fear completely overpowered any remaining common sense he had left. Trent grabbed a heavy black pen from the hotel desk. He did not read page 2 of the contract. He did not read page 10. He absolutely did not read page 47, where my brilliant lawyers had buried the fatal cross-collateralization clause. That specific and highly complex clause legally bound the new shell company directly to the $15 million toxic federal tax debt of my bankrupt shipping subsidiary. Trent flipped directly to the very last page of the thick document. He pressed the pen hard to the paper and signed his name with a rapid and desperate intensity. He laughed a short, breathless laugh as he wrote his signature. He handed the signed document back to the waiting courier and slammed the hotel door shut. The courier walked calmly down the hallway and handed the signed document directly to me in the lobby. I looked down at the dark, wet ink on the crisp white paper. Trent Caldwell had just eagerly signed his own financial death warrant. I took a high-resolution picture of the signature page and sent it directly to my legal team waiting in their downtown high-rise office. I gave them the green light to execute the final devastating maneuver. My corporate lawyers did not waste a single second. They immediately uploaded the signed corporate merger documents into the federal electronic filing system. The digital transfer took exactly 14 seconds to complete. It was a completely silent explosion. There was no smoke, and there was no fire. But deep inside the heavily fortified servers of the United States Internal Revenue Service, an automated and irreversible alarm was instantly triggered. The federal computer systems quickly registered that a new chief executive officer had just willingly claimed full ownership of a company loaded with $15 million in severe unpaid tax liens. The federal government does not wait or ask polite questions when it comes to massive corporate tax evasion. The automated system immediately sent an emergency freeze directive out to the national banking grid. The digital signal traveled through underground fiber optic cables targeting every single financial account connected to the Social Security number of Trent Caldwell. Back up in the luxurious groom's suite, Trent was pouring himself another full glass of expensive champagne. I could hear him humming a happy tune through the audio bug. He was smiling at his own reflection in the mirror, truly believing he had just stolen a massive fortune and saved his own life from the unforgiving crime syndicate. He raised his crystal glass to toast his father and celebrate their incoming wealth. But before the expensive crystal could even touch his lips, his smartphone vibrated violently on the cold marble counter. He picked it up with a highly confident and arrogant smirk. That smug smirk vanished instantly from his face. His pale skin drained of all color, turning the shade of dirty snow. A glaring red notification from his primary bank flashed across the bright screen. It was quickly followed by a second urgent notification from his private investment account. Then a third rapid alert popped up from his primary credit card provider. Every single personal and business bank account under his name had just been permanently frozen by the federal government. The dominoes had finally started to fall, and they were going to crush him completely. I stood in the quiet corner of the hotel lobby, pressing the small earpiece deeper into my ear to catch every single sound. The audio feed from the groom's suite was crystal clear. Just moments ago, the room had been filled with the arrogant laughter of a man who believed he had just stolen a $12 million fortune. Now there was nothing but a suffocating and heavy silence. I could hear the rapid and frantic tapping of fingers against the glass screen of a smartphone. Through the audio feed, I heard his breathing change entirely. It shifted from calm and measured to short, ragged gasps of pure panic. Trent was staring at a wall of glowing red notifications on his banking application. His primary checking account was locked. His offshore investment portfolios were inaccessible. His premium credit lines were entirely frozen. The digital walls of his fake empire were collapsing inward at the speed of light. Trent muttered a string of curses under his breath. It sounded like a desperate plea to a higher power he did not even believe in. He paced back and forth across the thick carpet of the suite, making his expensive leather shoes sink heavily into the floor. He tried to refresh his banking application over and over again, hoping it was just a temporary glitch in the system. But the federal government does not experience glitches when they seize criminal assets. The warning banners remained permanently burned onto his screen. I listened as Trent frantically dialed the exclusive customer service line for his wealth management bank. He did not bother with pleasantries when the representative answered the phone. He demanded to know why his accounts were showing an administrative hold. He tried to project the booming authority of a wealthy aristocrat, but his voice cracked with absolute terror. The bank representative placed him on a brief hold. Those 40 seconds of hold music must have felt like 40 years in a lightless prison cell for Trent Caldwell. I heard him pacing faster and running his sweating hands through his perfectly styled hair. Finally, the representative returned to the line. The woman on the phone sounded highly professional and completely detached from his panic. She informed him that the bank had not initiated the freeze. She explained that a federal mandate had just been executed directly by the Internal Revenue Service. Trent stopped pacing immediately. He demanded a thorough explanation. He yelled that he paid all his taxes and that he was a highly respected financial consultant in the city of Chicago. The representative calmly corrected his false assumptions. She stated that the federal freeze was not related to his previous personal accounts. It was directly tied to a new corporate entity he had just legally claimed ownership of less than 20 minutes ago. The company was registered under the name Lakefront Holdings. The representative read the terrifying details aloud to him. She told Trent that as the sole signing chief executive officer of Lakefront Holdings, he had legally assumed total personal liability for an outstanding federal tax lien. Trent asked how much the lien was. The representative delivered the fatal blow without any emotion. $15 million. She explained that the debt was a cross-collateralized corporate penalty from a defaulted shipping subsidiary, and the federal government had instantly seized all his liquid assets to begin satisfying the massive deficit. Trent dropped the crystal champagne flute he was holding. The expensive glass shattered into 100 sharp pieces against the marble floor. He screamed into the phone demanding to speak to a senior manager, but the representative simply advised him to retain criminal defense counsel before disconnecting the call completely. Trent was hyperventilating now. I could hear the desperate wheezing of a man who realized he was drowning with a massive iron anchor tied to his feet. Before he could even process the magnitude of the $15 million federal debt, his phone began to vibrate violently again. I recognized the custom ringtone he had assigned to his mistress. It was Chloe, the young money launderer who helped him run his illegal schemes. Trent answered the phone, hoping she could somehow move some hidden offshore funds to save him from the mob deadline that was rapidly approaching. But Chloe was not calling to save him. She was calling to destroy him. Her voice came through the speakerphone sharp and hysterical. She was yelling so loudly the audio bug easily picked up every single vicious word. She demanded to know what Trent had just done to her. She told him that she was standing at a bank teller window and every single one of her personal and business accounts had just been flagged and frozen by federal authorities. Because Trent had used her as a co-signer on several of his fraudulent financial vehicles, the government algorithms had instantly linked her accounts to his new massive tax debt. The federal net had swept her up right alongside him. Trent tried to calm her down. He begged her to listen and promised he would fix the misunderstanding. Chloe let out a cold and venomous laugh. She told him there was no fixing a federal tax seizure of this magnitude. She realized that the mob money was gone and the grand escape plan to Europe was completely dead. Chloe was staring down the barrel of a long federal prison sentence, and she was not going to take the fall for his catastrophic mistake. She yelled that she was not going to let a pathetic, arrogant loser drag her down into the dirt. She told Trent she was leaving the bank and driving straight to the field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She promised to hand over every single ledger, every hidden hard drive, and every forged document proving he had been running a scam and stealing identities. Trent begged her to stop, but the line went dead. She had abandoned him to the wolves. The audio feed captured the sound of pure, chaotic panic inside the room. Trent was tearing the luxurious groom suite apart piece by piece. He flipped over heavy chairs and swept expensive floral arrangements off the tables. He was desperately searching for the thick brown leather folder the courier had delivered earlier. When he finally found it, he ripped the documents out and threw them onto the glass coffee table. I could picture his pale, sweating face leaning over the papers. He ignored the signature page he had so eagerly signed just half an hour ago. He started flipping backward through the thick stack of dense legal jargon. He was finally doing what he should have done in the very beginning. He was reading the fine print. I listened to the frantic rustling of paper as his trembling fingers traced the complex corporate clauses my elite legal team had constructed. He skimmed past the property transfer details and hit the corporate merger section. I heard his breathing stop completely. He read the cross-collateralization clause out loud to himself in a broken whisper. He read the specific part where he willingly accepted the toxic debts of the defunct Detroit Shipping Company in exchange for the lake house deed. The horrifying realization finally washed over him. The grand illusion of his own superior intelligence shattered into absolute dust. He realized that the tired, uneducated black mechanic from the South Side had not been a helpless victim. He realized I had played him from the very first second he sat down at the engagement dinner. I had seen right through his cheap, aristocratic facade. I had recognized his greed, and I had built a custom-made guillotine just for him. I had handed him the rope, and he had eagerly tied the noose around his own neck. He whispered my name in the quiet room. It was not a statement of arrogance anymore. It was a realization of pure terror. He knew he had just challenged a monster who was infinitely more dangerous than the Chicago crime syndicate he owed money to. Trent was sitting on the floor of the suite, completely paralyzed by fear and impending doom. The mob deadline was closing in fast. The federal government had seized his entire life. His mistress was on her way to the authorities to turn him in. He had absolutely nothing left. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the suite swung open. I heard the loud and obnoxious voices of his parents entering the room. Richard and Susan Caldwell walked in complaining bitterly about the hotel staff. Richard sounded annoyed and slightly intoxicated. He loudly demanded to know what was wrong with the financial accounts. Richard explained that he and Susan had just tried to order a round of expensive vintage scotch at the premium hotel bar downstairs. He said the bartender had swiped the gold credit card belonging to Susan, and it had been immediately declined. Richard said he then tried to use his own platinum card, and the machine had flagged it for suspected fraud and confiscated the card right over the counter. Richard was deeply embarrassed that a man of his supposed pedigree had been treated like a common beggar in front of the other wealthy wedding guests. Susan chimed in complaining that the hotel manager had refused to run a tab for them. They demanded that Trent fix the embarrassing banking error immediately so they could go back to celebrating their incoming wealth. Through the audio feed, I heard Trent let out a sound that was half sob and half hysterical laughter. He looked up at his arrogant, ignorant parents. The final piece of the devastating puzzle clicked into place in his mind. Richard and Susan had been financially bankrupt for 5 years. Their entire luxurious country club lifestyle was strictly funded by supplementary cards tied directly to the primary banking accounts belonging to Trent. Because Trent had legally tied himself to my $15 million toxic corporate debt, the federal government had not just frozen his money. The Internal Revenue Service had followed the digital money trail right down to the supplementary accounts of his parents. The federal freeze had locked down the entire Caldwell family in one single sweeping motion. They were all completely bankrupt. They were all trapped, and the ruthless mob enforcers were waiting outside the building to collect a massive debt that could never be paid. The total destruction I had promised them was now absolute and final. I stood by the grand window at the end of the second-floor hallway looking down at the busy street below. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was time to deliver the fatal strike. I sent a single text message to Marcus, my lead corporate attorney. The message simply said, "Execute Phase 2." Miles away in a high-rise office, my legal team did not hesitate. They pressed a button and transmitted a massive encrypted dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrimes Division in Chicago. This was not just a simple complaint. It was a perfectly organized digital execution. I had spent 40 years building a logistics empire, and I knew exactly how to track every single movement a person makes. My investigators had spent weeks compiling this file, and it was absolutely devastating. The federal file contained every single internet protocol address, every login record, and every forged digital signature, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Trent Caldwell had stolen my daughter's identity. The dossier detailed exactly how Trent had used Maya's social security number to secure $200,000 in fraudulent commercial bridge loans. But I did not stop with just Trent. The federal files also contained irrefutable proof that his arrogant parents, Richard and Susan Caldwell, had actively participated in the fraud. They had acted as co-signers on the illicit accounts, using their own personal devices to verify the stolen identity of my child. They had built their fake country club lifestyle on the back of my pregnant daughter. Now the federal government had all the evidence they needed to lock the entire Caldwell family in a federal penitentiary for a very long time. The automated alerts at the Federal Bureau would be flashing red right now. Arrest warrants were already being drafted. While the federal agents were scrambling their response teams downtown, a much darker and faster threat was arriving right outside the hotel. I looked down through the thick glass of the hallway window. 3 massive, unmarked black sport utility vehicles aggressively swerved into the hotel driveway. They completely ignored the valet parking signs and mounted the curb, blocking the main entrance. The heavy doors of the vehicles swung open in perfect unison. 6 men stepped out onto the pavement. They were not wearing police uniforms. They wore dark, tailored suits and moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of professional violence. These were the enforcers for the Chicago crime syndicate. They had received my anonymous tip about the wedding location, and they were not here to celebrate. Trent's 48-hour deadline to repay his $4 million debt had officially expired. The men did not bother checking in with the hotel security desk. They smoothly bypassed the revolving doors and took up strategic positions around the perimeter of the building. 2 of them stood directly blocking the main lobby exits. Another 2 walked around the side of the building to cover the emergency fire escapes. They were sealing the building with military precision. Nobody was getting out. I watched them secure the exits and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Trent was completely trapped in a golden cage. The mob wanted their $4 million, or they wanted his life, and they were not going to leave empty-handed. I pressed my earpiece deeper into my ear to listen to the live audio feed coming from the groom's suite down the hall. The sheer panic inside that room had reached a boiling point. Richard and Susan Caldwell were screaming at their son, demanding to know why their platinum credit cards were being declined at the hotel bar. They were complaining about being humiliated in front of their wealthy white friends. They demanded that Trent call his bank and fix the embarrassing mistake immediately. They had absolutely no idea that they were completely bankrupt and under active federal investigation. They still believed they were the untouchable aristocratic elite. But Trent was not listening to them anymore. Through the audio feed, I heard the heavy thud of Trent walking over to the suite window. I heard the rustle of the heavy curtains being pulled back. Then I heard him let out a sharp, gasping breath. He had spotted the unmarked black vehicles down on the street. He recognized the men standing by the doors. The ruthless reality of his situation finally crashed down on him like a concrete wall. Trent realized he could not walk down the aisle and marry Maya. The entire master plan was completely dead. If he went downstairs to the ceremony, the syndicate enforcers would grab him in front of hundreds of witnesses and drag him into the back of an SUV. Trent was hyperventilating now. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing through the hidden microphone. He started connecting all the terrifying dots in his head. He had no $12 million lake house to sell to pay off the mob. The property transfer had been a lethal trap that saddled him with $15 million in toxic federal tax debt. The government had frozen every single penny he had left to his name. His mistress Chloe had abandoned him to the authorities. He had absolutely zero leverage, zero cash, and zero time. He was a dead man walking, and he finally knew it. The survival instinct of a cornered rat is a pathetic thing to witness. Trent stopped trying to act like an educated gentleman. He shed his fake upper-class skin entirely. He yelled at his parents to shut up. His voice was shrill and cracking with raw, primitive fear. He told Richard and Susan that the money was gone and that they were on their own. I heard Susan gasp in shock as her golden boy screamed at her. Trent did not care about them anymore. He did not care about his bride or his fake life. He needed to escape before the mob enforcers found out which room he was hiding in. I heard the sound of expensive fabric ripping as Trent frantically tore off his tailored wedding jacket and threw it onto the floor. He ripped the silk tie from his neck, trying to make himself less recognizable. He was shedding the costume of the wealthy financial advisor, trying to turn himself into a ghost. He threw open the heavy wooden door of the groom's suite and sprinted out into the carpeted hallway. He left his parents standing in the room, completely bewildered and financially destroyed. I stood calmly near the end of the long corridor. I knew the architectural layout of this luxury hotel better than anyone. I had spent my life optimizing supply chains and mapping out delivery routes. I knew how to predict movement. I knew that a desperate man running from the main lobby would never take the grand staircase. He would avoid the main passenger elevators because they opened directly into the hands of the syndicate waiting below. He would look for the discreet service elevators used by the catering staff and the housekeeping crew. Those hidden elevators led straight down to the underground loading dock, which was the only viable exit left in the entire building. I walked slowly over to the service elevator alcove. The hallway was quiet and lined with elegant floral arrangements. I smoothed the lapels of my black tuxedo and clasped my hands patiently behind my back. I stood squarely in front of the metal elevator doors. I did not have to wait long. I heard the frantic, heavy footsteps of Trent Caldwell sprinting down the long hallway. He was breathing like a hunted animal. His expensive leather shoes were slipping on the polished marble sections of the floor. He came tearing around the corner at full speed, desperately reaching for the service elevator call button. He was looking over his shoulder, terrified that the mob was already chasing him. He crashed directly into me. The impact sent him stumbling backward. He gasped for air, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He looked up, expecting to see a hotel worker or a security guard blocking his path. Instead, he saw me. I stood perfectly still, blocking the only path to safety he had left. I looked down at the sweating, trembling fraud who had tried to destroy my pregnant daughter. He looked at my calm expression and realized that the uneducated old black mechanic from the South Side had orchestrated every single second of his destruction. The hunt was officially over. Trent slammed into my chest with the force of a desperate hunted animal. He was breathing so heavily I could feel the heat of his panic. The expensive cologne he always wore was entirely overpowered by the sour, undeniable stench of pure fear. He looked up and saw me standing perfectly still in front of the brushed steel doors of the service elevator. For a fraction of a second, he looked relieved. He thought I was just a clueless old man wandering the halls who could be easily pushed out of the way. But then he looked directly into my eyes. He saw the cold, absolute certainty staring back at him. He realized I was not trapped in the hallway with him. He was trapped in the hallway with me. His fake, aristocratic charm dissolved completely. The polished financial advisor vanished, leaving only a desperate street-level con artist. He lunged forward and grabbed the lapels of my custom black tuxedo. His hands were shaking violently. He shoved me backward against the heavy metal elevator doors. He did not bother keeping his voice down anymore. He let his true, vicious nature bleed out into the open. He screamed right into my face. He called me every vile racial slur he could think of. He told me I was nothing but an ignorant thug from the slums who got lucky with a few delivery trucks. He demanded that I call my lawyers right that exact second. He ordered me to reverse the property transfer, to take back the limited liability company, and to clear his name with the federal government immediately. He threatened to kill me right there in the hallway if I did not pick up my phone and fix the massive disaster I had just created for him. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to defend myself or push him away. I simply looked down at his trembling fists clutching my jacket. I told him to take his hands off me. I spoke with a voice so low and so steady that it cut straight through his hysterical screaming. I told him that if he did not step back, I would not even need the crime syndicate waiting downstairs to end his life. He saw the absolute truth in my eyes, and his survival instinct kicked in. His hands instinctively released my jacket. He stumbled backward, panting heavily. I slowly straightened my tuxedo and looked at him with pure disgust. I calmly explained the brutal reality of his situation. I told him that federal corporate mergers are instantaneous and completely irreversible. I explained that the moment his signature hit that paper, the digital transfer became a matter of permanent federal record. The Internal Revenue Service does not offer refunds or cancellations for $15 million in toxic corporate debt. I told him he legally owned that defunct Detroit shipping company now, and the government would hunt him to the ends of the earth to collect every single penny. I watched the last remaining shred of hope drain entirely out of his pale, sweating face. Trent tried to stutter out a denial. He tried to claim it was all a big misunderstanding and that he was just a legitimate businessman facing a temporary cash flow problem. I cut him off immediately. I decided to show him exactly how deep his grave truly was. I recited his entire life story back to him. I told him I knew his broker license had been permanently revoked 3 years ago. I told him I knew his parents, Richard and Susan, were completely bankrupt frauds living off stolen money. Trent's eyes widened in sheer terror. Then I delivered the heavier blows. I mentioned the exact sum of $4 million. I mentioned the specific Chicago crime syndicate waiting for him right outside the hotel lobby doors. I watched his knees physically buckle as he realized I knew about the mob. I did not stop there. I told him about Chloe. I used her name. I told him that his 20-something money launderer and mistress was currently sitting in a federal field office handing over his hard drives and ledgers to the authorities because she refused to take the fall for his catastrophic stupidity. I told him that she had abandoned him the second the federal freeze hit her accounts. Trent completely lost his mind. His brain could no longer process the absolute magnitude of his defeat. When a narcissistic predator is completely cornered, they do not beg for forgiveness. They lash out with everything they have left, trying to inflict as much pain as possible. Trent's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. He started screaming at the top of his lungs. He did not care who hurt him anymore. He wanted to hurt me. He wanted to prove that he was still superior even as his world burned to the ground. He screamed his entire master plan out loud, echoing down the long marble hallway. He yelled that he never loved Maya for a single second. He called her a pathetic, naive target who was desperate for a white knight to validate her success. He proudly confessed that he had already stolen her social security number to take out $200,000 in fraudulent commercial bridge loans. He screamed that his plan was absolutely perfect until I ruined it. He bragged about how he was going to marry her just to secure the deed to the $12 million lake house. He told me exactly how he was going to liquidate my property, pay off the syndicate, and flee to Europe with Chloe. He laughed a hysterical, manic laugh as he described his final move. He screamed that he was going to leave a fake paper trail pointing the federal investigators directly at Maya. He yelled that he wanted my precious, brilliant daughter to take the fall for his entire Ponzi scheme. He said he wanted me to watch her rot in a federal prison cell for 20 years while he lived like a king overseas. I told him Maya was a brilliant woman, but she needed to hear the truth directly from the source. I slowly stepped aside, moving away from the large decorative marble pillar I had been standing next to. The space behind the pillar was revealed. Standing there in her flawless, flowing white silk wedding dress was my daughter Maya. She had been standing in the shadows the entire time. She had heard every single vile, racist, and horrific word Trent had just screamed. She knew everything. During my daughter's engagement dinner, she picked up her fiancé phone, placed it firmly on the glass table, and glared at him with a look that could freeze boiling water. "I know exactly what you have been doing," she said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I stayed completely still, nursing my bourbon, letting the heavy tension hang in the air as I waited for his reaction. "I am Monroe Pierce, 75 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire from the unforgiving streets of the south side of Chicago. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled the man sitting across from me that night, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a father's instinct is never wrong." Trent Caldwell froze completely. The hysterical screaming that had just ripped through the quiet hotel corridor died instantly in his throat. His pale blue eyes widened to an impossible size as he stared at the woman standing just a few feet away from him. Maya was standing completely still behind the large decorative marble pillar. She was wearing her immaculate white silk wedding dress. It was the dress she was supposed to wear as she walked down the aisle to become his wife. But there was no love in her eyes anymore. There was only the absolute devastating realization of the truth. For a long and suffocating moment, the hallway was entirely silent. The only sound was the ragged and heavy breathing coming from Trent's chest. His brain was desperately trying to process the catastrophic reality of what had just happened. He had just confessed to every single one of his horrific crimes. He had screamed his plan to steal $12 million. He had bragged about taking out fraudulent bridge loans using her social security number. He had proudly detailed how he was going to abandon her to take the fall for his massive federal tax fraud and flee to Europe with his mistress. And she had heard every single vile word. Trent did exactly what a cornered predator always does. He tried to lie his way out of a burning building. He stumbled forward, reaching his trembling hands out toward Maya. He forced a pathetic and desperate smile onto his sweating face. He tried to revert to the same manipulative gaslighting tactics that had worked so perfectly at the engagement dinner just a few weeks ago. He started stammering and speaking in a high-pitched, frantic voice. "Maya, baby, please listen to me," he pleaded. "You have to understand what is happening here. Your father cornered me. He has been threatening me. I only said those terrible things because he provoked me. I was just trying to make him angry. None of it is true. You know how much I love you. You know I would never do anything to hurt you or our baby. It is the crime syndicate, Maya. They have been threatening my life, and it made me say crazy things. Please, baby, you have to believe me." He took another step toward her, hoping she would break down in tears, just like she had at the restaurant. He expected her to crumble under the emotional weight of the betrayal. He expected her to seek his comfort, to desperately want the fairy tale to be real. But Maya did not cry. She did not shed a single tear. Trent had completely underestimated who he was dealing with. He looked at her and saw a soft, naive doctor who was desperate for a wealthy white husband. He forgot that she was the daughter of a self-made logistics tycoon. She was raised by a man who had built an empire from the unforgiving streets of the south side of Chicago. She had inherited her father's ice-cold composure and his unbreakable titanium spine. Maya simply stood there looking at the pathetic, sweating fraud in front of her. Her posture was perfectly straight. Her beautiful face was completely devoid of any emotion. She looked at Trent not as a heartbroken bride, but as a highly trained surgeon inspecting a diseased and cancerous tumor that needed to be permanently excised from a healthy body. "Stop talking, Trent," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a razor-sharp authority that echoed down the long marble hallway. It sliced right through his frantic lies and silenced him instantly. "You are a pathetic and disgusting parasite. You thought you were so incredibly smart. You thought you could come into our lives, smile in our faces, and use my unborn child as a shield for your pathetic criminal debts. You are nothing but a coward, wearing a borrowed suit." Trent stood there trembling, completely paralyzed by the sheer force of her absolute rejection. He had never seen this side of her. He had never seen the ruthless tycoon hiding beneath her warm and caring exterior. He swallowed hard, trying to find another lie, another angle to play, but his mind was completely blank. Maya slowly reached her right hand over to her left hand. She placed her fingers on the heavy $50,000 diamond engagement ring resting on her finger. It was the ring Trent had bought using the stolen money from his collapsing Ponzi scheme. It was the ultimate symbol of his fake love and his staggering deception. She did not struggle to take it off. She pulled the heavy platinum band right off her finger with one smooth and decisive motion. She looked at the sparkling diamond for a brief second, and then she looked dead into Trent's terrified eyes. She did not hand the ring back to him. She drew her arm back and threw the heavy piece of jewelry directly at his face with incredible force. The $50,000 diamond flew through the air like a bullet. It struck Trent perfectly on the upper edge of his left cheekbone. The sharp, customized cut of the heavy stone sliced right through his pale skin. Trent let out a sharp cry of shock and physical pain. He stumbled backward, lifting his trembling hand to his face. He pressed his fingers against his cheek and pulled them away to see a bright smear of red blood. The physical pain was nothing compared to the absolute humiliation of being struck down by the woman he thought he had completely conquered. He looked at Maya with wide, terrified eyes, holding his bleeding cheek. He realized in that exact moment that he had lost absolutely everything. He had no money left. He had no property. He had no fake marriage to hide behind. And he had a bleeding wound on his face to match the absolute destruction of his massive ego. I stepped forward, leaving the shadows of the service elevator alcove. I walked slowly over to my daughter and stood proudly by her side. I looked at the bleeding and broken fraud cowering in the hallway. Trent thought the punishment was over, but I was not quite finished dismantling his entire existence. I needed to make sure that the illusion of the aristocratic Caldwell family was completely eradicated from Maya's mind forever. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my custom black tuxedo and pulled out my smartphone. I looked at Maya, and then I looked at Trent. I tapped the screen and opened the audio file I had recorded the night before at the Elite Whites-Only Country Club. I maximized the volume on the device and pressed play. The clear and undeniable audio of Richard Caldwell filled the quiet hotel corridor. The drunken, arrogant, and highly racist voice of Trent's father echoed off the marble walls and the crystal light fixtures. The recording played the exact moment Richard had cornered me at the rehearsal dinner. "You did good for a guy from the slums, Monroe," the recorded voice slurred heavily. "You made some money fixing trucks and you bought your daughter a nice life. But you need to step aside now. Let educated white men manage Maya's wealth. She needs a real man to secure her future, not a grease monkey from the South Side. You have no place in our world, Monroe. Just hand over the keys and fade into the background where you belong." The audio recording stopped. The silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than before. Trent lowered his hand from his bleeding cheek. He looked absolutely sick to his stomach. He knew that the recording of his father had just destroyed any possible narrative that his family was somehow innocent in all of this. They were all in on the scam. They all shared the same disgusting racist superiority complex. I put my phone back into my pocket. I turned my head slowly and looked at my beautiful, strong daughter. I spoke in a calm and deeply resonant voice, making sure Trent heard every single syllable. "This is what they think of us," I told her. "They look at our success and they feel entitled to steal it because they believe they are naturally superior. They smile in our faces and drink our champagne while they plot to throw us in federal prison. They are parasites, Maya, and we do not negotiate with parasites. We eradicate them." Maya nodded slowly, her eyes locked onto Trent with absolute contempt. She did not feel an ounce of pity for him. She understood exactly why I had orchestrated this massive financial execution. She understood why I had built the cross-collateralization snare and why I had let him dig his own grave. It was the only way to permanently protect our family from a predator who hid behind a charming smile. Trent took another step backward, pressing his back against the expensive floral wallpaper of the hallway. He was completely out of options. His mind was racing, trying to figure out a way to escape the hotel without running into the ruthless mob enforcers blocking the main lobby exits downstairs. He looked down both ends of the long corridor, desperately searching for a way out. But the time for escaping had officially expired. Before Trent could even take another step, a new and terrifying sound interrupted the heavy silence of the hallway. It was not the soft footsteps of hotel housekeeping staff. It was not the cheerful chatter of wedding guests. It was a loud, rhythmic, and highly synchronized sound coming from the far end of the corridor. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy tactical boots marching violently against the polished marble floor. Trent froze completely. He slowly turned his head to look down the long hallway. Maya and I turned to look as well. Marching purposefully toward us was a highly organized unit of federal agents. They were wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow letters printed boldly across the chest and back. They moved with absolute military precision, their faces set in grim, determined expressions. They were not hotel security and they were not local police. They were the federal authorities responding directly to the massive cybercrimes dossier my corporate legal team had submitted just a short time ago. The heavy footsteps echoed louder and louder, bouncing off the walls like the beating drums of an execution squad. They were marching straight toward the groom suite, and they were coming directly for Trent Caldwell. The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents thundered down the long marble hallway. Trent stood completely frozen, with his back pressed hard against the decorative wallpaper. He held his bleeding cheek and stared with wide, terrified eyes as the squad of 12 armed men in dark windbreakers marched aggressively toward him. He thought his life was over right in that exact second. He braced himself, expecting the agents to tackle him to the floor and read him his rights. But the lead federal agent did not even look at him. The entire squad marched right past Trent without breaking their stride. They completely ignored the bleeding groom cowering in the hallway. They had a much larger initial target to secure before dealing with him. I watched Trent slide down the wall in pure confusion as the agents bypassed him. He was breathing heavily, completely disoriented. I placed my hand gently on the small of Maya's back, and we followed the federal agents at a safe distance. I wanted my daughter to see exactly how empires built on lies are systematically dismantled. I wanted her to watch the absolute destruction of the arrogant people who thought they could use her life as a simple financial shield. The federal agents moved with terrifying speed and precision toward the exclusive VIP lounge at the far end of the grand hall. Inside that lavish room, the Caldwell family had gathered dozens of their fake aristocratic friends. The elite of Chicago were inside, sipping expensive champagne, eating caviar, and laughing loudly. Richard and Susan Caldwell were currently standing near the back emergency exit of the lounge. They had their expensive wool coats tightly gripped in their hands. They had finally realized that their platinum credit cards were completely frozen and their bank accounts were locked down. They were trying to sneak out the back door into the alley before the hotel management could publicly humiliate them over the unpaid luxury bar tab. They thought they were just dealing with a massive banking error. They had absolutely no idea that the United States government was about to drop the sky right on top of their heads. The heavy double wooden doors of the VIP lounge were kicked open with a massive crash. The loud, elegant jazz music playing in the room stopped instantly. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned around holding their crystal glasses in absolute shock. The lead federal agent stepped into the center of the room holding up his golden badge. His voice echoed through the massive hall with absolute authority. He called out the names of Richard and Susan Caldwell, commanding them to step forward. The sea of expensive tailored suits and designer silk dresses immediately parted. Nobody in high society wants to stand next to a target when the federal government comes knocking. Richard and Susan were left standing completely alone in the center of the plush carpet. Their aristocratic masks melted away in a single devastating second. Two large federal agents stepped forward and grabbed Richard tightly by his arms. Two other agents moved swiftly to secure Susan. The lead agent did not lower his voice to spare their feelings. He read them their rights loudly and clearly so every single one of their wealthy elite friends could hear every specific detail. He informed them they were under federal arrest for conspiracy wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He specifically and loudly stated that they had stolen the Social Security number of a medical professional to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent commercial loans. A collective gasp echoed across the grand hall. People covered their mouths in pure shock. The fake high society life the Caldwells had built for years was completely incinerated in front of their own community. Susan Caldwell, the woman who had insulted my daughter's background and bragged endlessly about her superior pedigree, completely lost her mind. She dropped her expensive designer coat and started thrashing and screaming at the top of her lungs. Her heavy diamond jewelry rattled as she fought aggressively against the federal agents. She screamed that she was a wealthy and important woman. She demanded her high-priced lawyers. She yelled that there had been a terrible mistake and immediately blamed everything on her own son. But the agents did not care about her country club membership or her expensive dress. They pulled her arms forcefully behind her back and locked the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed sharply through the quiet room. Richard Caldwell did not fight back at all. The man who had drunkenly cornered me the night before and told me to step aside because I was just a black mechanic from the slums completely crumbled under the pressure. His legs gave out entirely beneath him. He fell heavily to his knees on the expensive carpet and began to sob uncontrollably. He wept loudly like a terrified and broken child. All of his white privilege and all of his arrogant superiority vanished into thin air the very moment he realized he was going to die in a federal penitentiary. He could not even look his wealthy friends in the eye. Maya and I stood by the grand entrance of the lounge watching them being dragged away in total disgrace. I looked at my daughter and she nodded slowly. The ghosts of her self-doubt and her misplaced guilt were completely gone forever. She finally saw these people for the pathetic parasites they truly were. Then we turned our attention back to the main hallway. A secondary team of federal agents had circled back to secure the main prize. Trent was still cowering near the service elevator alcove. He was shaking violently while holding his bleeding cheek where the $50,000 diamond ring had cut him. He saw the secondary squad of agents approaching rapidly, and he immediately raised his trembling hands high in the air, surrendering completely. He did not have a single ounce of fight left in his body. The agents slammed Trent face first against the cold marble wall. They did not handle him gently. They kicked his legs apart and patted him down aggressively for hidden weapons. The lead agent for this squad stepped up right behind Trent and read him his extensive list of federal charges. The list was devastatingly long. Operating a massive Ponzi scheme, defrauding vulnerable investors, aggravated identity theft, and the final massive nail in the coffin was corporate federal tax evasion. Trent sobbed heavily against the marble wall. He begged the agents to please listen to him. He cried that he was willing to cooperate fully and that he would tell them absolutely everything about the offshore money laundering operations. He said he would testify against his mistress Chloe and even against his own parents if they just gave him a plea deal. He was a complete coward, eagerly selling out his own blood just to save his own skin. The federal agents completely ignored his pathetic begging. They locked the heavy steel cuffs tightly around his wrists and yanked him backward. They began to march him down the long, elegant hallway toward the grand staircase that led directly to the main hotel lobby. Maya and I walked slowly and silently behind them, watching the final pathetic moments of his freedom. As they escorted Trent down the staircase and through the massive glass lobby, the remaining wedding guests watched in absolute stunned silence. The man who had promised them a grand celebration of immense wealth was being paraded in handcuffs like a common street criminal. Trent was weeping openly now, his salty tears mixed with the dark red blood drying on his cheek. He looked completely pathetic and broken. The federal agents pushed him forcefully toward the rotating glass doors of the main hotel entrance. Trent looked out through the glass, hoping to see the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers. He truly thought that being locked inside a federal holding cell was the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to him today. He thought the United States government was his biggest problem. But as the agents marched him closer to the exit, Trent looked past the parked police vehicles. Standing quietly near the valet parking podium just outside the main doors were the men from the unmarked black sport utility vehicles. They had taken off their dark suit jackets and put on the uniform vests of the hotel valet staff. They blended in perfectly with the chaos of the federal raid, but Trent recognized them immediately. These were the ruthless and violent enforcers from the Chicago crime syndicate. Trent owed them $4 million and he had just missed his final 48-hour deadline. As Trent was marched out in handcuffs onto the pavement, he locked eyes directly with the lead mob enforcer. The mobster did not look angry or upset. He looked completely calm and relaxed. The enforcer looked right at Trent and smiled a cold and dead smile. He slowly raised his right hand up to his chest. He extended his index finger and pointed it directly at Trent's heart, while dropping his thumb slowly like the heavy hammer of a gun. He mimicked shooting him right there on the pavement in front of the federal agents. Trent completely stopped breathing. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His knees buckled immediately, and the federal agents had to physically carry him by his armpits toward the armored transport vehicle. In that horrifying and silent moment, Trent Caldwell finally understood the absolute magnitude of what I had done to him. The federal prison was not going to be a punishment for him. It was merely going to be a waiting room. I had not just taken his stolen money and his freedom. I had ensured that the crime syndicate knew exactly where to find him. He realized that no amount of federal protection or concrete walls would ever save him from the men he had stolen from. The trap had closed completely around his neck, and there was absolutely no way out. The federal agents did not care that Trent Caldwell was wearing a custom-tailored wedding tuxedo. They did not care that he was standing in the middle of a $12 million luxury hotel lobby surrounded by the highest echelons of Chicago high society. When his knees buckled from the sheer terror of seeing the syndicate enforcers waiting outside the glass doors, the agents did not gently hold him up. They forced him violently down onto the cold, polished marble floor. The sharp crack of his kneecaps hitting the hard stone echoed loudly across the grand foyer, slicing right through the chaotic noise of the raid. Two heavily armed federal agents pressed their heavy tactical boots firmly into his lower back, pinning him completely to the ground. They grabbed his wrists and pulled them aggressively backward, locking the heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his hands to ensure he could not move a single inch. Trent was hyperventilating. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow gasps that sounded like a dying engine. The blood from the deep cut on his cheek where Maya had thrown the $50,000 diamond ring was now dripping slowly down his jawline. The dark crimson blood stained the pristine white collar of his expensive dress shirt. He was completely stripped of his fake aristocratic armor. There was no arrogant smile left on his face. There was no condescending tone in his voice. He was nothing but a broken, desperate fraud bleeding on the floor in front of hundreds of stunned and silent wedding guests. He twisted his neck awkwardly against the heavy pressure of the federal agent's boot. He looked desperately around the massive lobby, searching for any possible lifeline. His parents, Richard and Susan, were already being dragged out through the side doors by a separate squad of agents, crying and screaming about their ruined country club reputations. His mistress, Chloe, was currently sitting in a federal field office handing over every single encrypted hard drive and hidden ledger to save her own skin. Trent had absolutely no one left in his corner. And then his frantic, pale eyes finally landed on me. I was standing calmly at the base of the grand marble staircase with Maya safely by my side. Trent looked at me and his entire face crumbled into an expression of pure, pathetic agony. He started begging. The man who had mocked my background and called me an uneducated mechanic from the slums was now weeping openly and pleading for his life. He screamed my name across the silent lobby. He begged me to help him. He cried that I had enough money in my logistics empire to pay off the $15 million federal tax lien. He sobbed that I could easily wire $4 million to the Chicago crime syndicate to call off the hitmen waiting right outside the glass doors. He swore that if I just saved his life, he would disappear forever and never come near my family again. He was offering me promises that were as worthless as the fake financial portfolios he used to scam his vulnerable investors. I did not say a single word from across the room. I slowly let go of Maya's arm and took a deliberate step forward. The massive crowd of wealthy elite guests parted silently, making a wide path for me as I walked across the polished marble floor. The federal agents looked up at me, but they did not intervene. They could see the absolute authority radiating from my posture. They knew exactly who had orchestrated this entire takedown. They loosened their grip on Trent just enough to let him lift his head from the cold stone. I stopped right in front of him. I looked down at his tear-stained face and his ruin-tailored suit. I slowly lowered myself down, bending my knees until I was kneeling right at his eye level. We were face to face in the middle of the sprawling lobby. Trent was shaking so violently his teeth were actually chattering. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, thinking that my kneeling was a sign of mercy. He thought I was coming to offer him a lifeline. He thought the rich old man was finally going to take pity on him and protect him from the wolves waiting outside. I reached my hands out toward his throat. Trent flinched, but I did not strike him. I simply reached up and took hold of his expensive silk tie. It had been twisted and pulled askew when the agents tackled him to the floor. With slow and methodical precision, I adjusted the knot, tightening it neatly against his bloody collar. I smoothed the lapels of his ruined jacket, flattening out the expensive fabric. I wanted him to look presentable for his final journey into absolute darkness. I leaned in very close to him until my face was only inches from his ear. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a lethal frozen whisper that was meant entirely for him and him alone. I wanted these words to echo in his mind every single night for the rest of his miserable life. You looked at a black man with grease on his hands and saw an easy mark. I whispered slowly, making sure he absorbed every single syllable. You forgot that to build an empire in this city, I had to crush men exactly like you 40 years ago. Enjoy the feds, Trent, if the mob does not get you first. I gave the silk knot on his tie one final hard tug, pulling it tight around his neck like a hangman's noose. I looked dead into his terrified, pale eyes, watching the absolute realization of his permanent destruction wash over him. Trent let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying animal gasping for its final breath. All the color permanently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. The reality of his unavoidable execution completely settled into his bones. He knew the federal agents holding him down were simply his armed escort to the slaughterhouse. He knew the syndicate enforcers waiting outside the glass doors would have endless patience. They would reach him in the holding cells, or they would reach him in the federal penitentiary. It did not matter where the government locked him away. His life was officially and permanently over. The trap I had built for him was completely inescapable. I did not wait to watch him process his own death. I calmly stood back up and smoothed the front of my black tuxedo jacket. I completely turned my back on him, dismissing his existence entirely from my world. I walked slowly and purposefully back across the marble floor toward the grand staircase where my daughter was waiting for me. Maya was standing tall and unbroken in her immaculate white silk wedding dress. She looked at me with a profound understanding and a quiet, unbreakable strength. She knew exactly what I had just done to protect her and her unborn child. She knew that I had permanently removed a deadly tumor from our lives. I reached the bottom of the stairs and gently offered my right arm to Maya. She smiled a small, genuine smile and looped her arm firmly through mine. We turned our backs to the chaotic scene unfolding in the center of the lobby. The federal agents violently yanked Trent up from the marble floor, hauling him to his feet by his handcuffed arms. Trent finally broke down completely. He started screaming in absolute terror. His voice echoed violently off the high ceilings and the crystal chandeliers. He thrashed against the federal agents, begging them not to take him outside where the syndicate men were waiting. His screams were high-pitched and filled with pure, unfiltered agony. But Maya and I did not look back. We did not even break our stride. We walked together slowly and elegantly, ascending the grand, sweeping staircase side by side. We left the screaming fraud behind us, fading into nothing but a pathetic background noise. We moved upward with the calm dignity of a family that had faced absolute evil and emerged completely victorious. At the top of the stairs, the entire assembly of wealthy wedding guests was standing in absolute stunned silence. Hundreds of elite aristocrats were frozen in place, holding their crystal glasses, staring at us in complete shock. They had just witnessed the total annihilation of the Caldwell family. The arrogant people who had looked down on us and judged our background were now standing completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of my retaliation. They realized that the quiet man from the south side of Chicago possessed a terrifying power that they could not even begin to comprehend. I looked out over the silent, terrified crowd. My expression was perfectly blank and entirely unapologetic. I caught the eye of the head catering manager who was standing frozen near a towering display of expensive vintage champagne. He was holding a silver tray tightly in his hands, unsure if the massive celebration was officially canceled. I did not say a single word. I simply gave the catering manager a calm, casual nod and signaled with my hand to start pouring the drinks. The execution was completely over, and it was time to celebrate our survival. The weeks following the dramatic raid were a masterclass in total public annihilation. The story of the fake aristocratic family did not just make the local evening news. It completely dominated the front page of the Chicago Tribune for 14 consecutive days. I sat in my quiet kitchen every single morning, sipping my black coffee and reading the detailed financial obituaries of the people who had tried to destroy my daughter. The journalists dug into every single dark corner of the Caldwell family history. They exposed the 5-year-old bankruptcy records for the entire city to see. They published high-resolution photographs of the rented luxury cars and the leased penthouse apartment, proving that the family possessed absolutely zero generational wealth. The entire high society circle that Richard and Susan had desperately tried to impress completely turned their backs on them overnight. When Richard and Susan faced the federal judge for their arraignment, they stood in the cold courtroom wearing standard-issue orange jumpsuits. They looked pathetic and entirely broken. Their exhausted public defenders pleaded for bail, arguing that they were respected members of the community who posed no threat to anyone. The federal judge, a no-nonsense woman who absolutely despised financial predators, took one long look at the massive cybercrimes dossier my legal team had provided. She slammed her wooden gavel down and completely denied their bail without a second thought. She declared them an extreme flight risk and remanded them directly back to federal holding. Susan literally collapsed to her knees, weeping and screaming that her expensive designer shoes were being ruined by the dirty courtroom floor. Nobody in the room offered her a helping hand. Meanwhile, Trent's 20-something mistress Chloe realized very quickly that her loyalty had a strict expiration date. The moment the federal investigators pulled her into an interrogation room and offered her a plea deal, she sang like a canary. She turned state's witness and handed over every single encrypted ledger detailing the millions of dollars Trent had stolen and laundered through her accounts. She gave the federal authorities the names, the dates, and the exact routing numbers for his hidden offshore portfolios. She genuinely thought her complete and eager cooperation would allow her to walk away totally free. She was incredibly mistaken. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case was absolutely ruthless. Because of the sheer magnitude of the financial destruction she had helped facilitate, the judge still handed her a mandatory 5-year sentence in a minimum security federal prison. She would spend the rest of her vibrant 20s wearing a khaki uniform and deeply regretting the day she ever answered a phone call from Trent Caldwell. But a minimum security prison was a luxury resort compared to the absolute living hell that Trent Caldwell was currently experiencing. He was locked away in the Metropolitan Correctional Center right in the rigid heart of downtown Chicago. Trent foolishly believed that being surrounded by federal guards and thick concrete walls would protect him from the Chicago crime syndicate. He completely forgot that the syndicate operates constantly above and below the law. Their reach extends deeply into the federal prison system through guards and inmates alike. My private investigator kept me updated on every single miserable detail of Trent's daily incarceration. A week after his highly publicized arrest, Trent was walking through the crowded prison commissary trying to buy a cheap cup of instant coffee. He was suddenly and violently cornered by 3 massive inmates who had direct affiliations with the mob bosses he had stolen from. They did not kill him because a dead man cannot pay off a $4 million debt. But they needed to send a very clear and very painful message. The inmates dragged Trent into a blind spot completely away from the overhead security cameras. They beat him with a brutal and terrifying efficiency, breaking 3 of his ribs and fracturing his collarbone. Before they left him bleeding and gasping for air on the cold concrete floor, one of the men leaned down and whispered directly into his ear. The man told Trent that the interest on his massive debt was compounding every single day and that they would be coming back to collect another physical payment next week. Trent was discharged from the prison infirmary 4 days later. He now lives in a state of constant, uninterrupted terror. He cannot sleep a full night. He cannot eat his food. He jumps at every single passing shadow and trembles violently every time his heavy steel cell door opens. The deep psychological torture he wanted to inflict on my daughter is exactly what he is experiencing every single second of his pathetic existence. While the Caldwell family was drowning in the deep end of the federal justice system, my own family was experiencing an incredible sense of peace and total restoration. I did not leave anything to chance regarding Maya's future. I unleashed my entire corporate legal team to scrub her identity completely clean. Marcus and his ruthless attorneys took the massive digital dossier we had compiled and marched straight into the headquarters of the federal credit bureaus. They presented the irrefutable evidence that Trent had forged her signature and manipulated internet protocol addresses to secure the $200,000 in fraudulent commercial loans. Because the evidence was absolutely bulletproof, the federal agencies expedited the entire correction process. Within 3 short weeks, every single fraudulent account was permanently erased from her financial history. Her pristine credit score was entirely restored to its original flawless state. She did not have to hire a defense lawyer. She did not have to sit in a courtroom and defend her honor to a skeptical judge. My legal team handled all the heavy lifting in absolute silence while she rested comfortably in the safety of our home. The most important victory, however, had absolutely nothing to do with money or legal vindication. A month after the dramatic raid, I drove Maya to her scheduled appointment with her specialist obstetrician. The medical clinic was bright and calm, offering a complete contrast to the chaos we had left behind in that hotel lobby. Maya lay back on the examination table as the doctor carefully applied the cool ultrasound gel to her stomach. I stood quietly by her side, holding her hand tightly. The room was completely silent for a few seconds as the doctor moved the scanner around looking for the signal. And then the most beautiful sound in the entire world filled the small clinic room. It was the strong, rapid, and perfectly steady heartbeat of my unborn grandchild. The doctor smiled warmly and pointed to the digital monitor showing us the small, healthy shape. He told us that the baby was growing perfectly and that Maya's blood pressure had completely stabilized since her hospital scare. He said whatever we were doing to keep her stress levels down was working absolute wonders for her maternal health. I looked at Maya, and she squeezed my hand with tears of pure joy shining in her dark eyes. This was exactly why I had carried the massive burden of this war entirely on my own shoulders. I had absorbed all the cortisol, all the panic, and all the toxic hostility so that she could bring this new life into the world in absolute peace. I had completely shielded her from the monster, and now her beautiful future was entirely secure. A few days later, I was sitting alone in my dark mahogany home office. The crisp morning sun was streaming through the tall glass windows, casting long, elegant shadows across the expensive Persian rug. I was drinking my black coffee and sorting through the daily stack of mail my assistant had left on the corner of my desk. There were standard business contracts, logistics reports, and basic corporate correspondence. But buried near the bottom of the neat stack was a very strange and dirty envelope. It was not printed on premium corporate cardstock like the rest of my mail. It was made of cheap, thin, recycled paper that felt rough to the touch. I looked at the return address stamped in bold black ink in the upper left corner of the envelope. It was an official processing stamp from the Cook County Department of Corrections. I narrowed my eyes in quiet curiosity and picked up my silver letter opener. I sliced the top of the envelope smoothly and pulled out a single sheet of yellow-lined notebook paper. The handwriting on the page was shaky, frantic, and completely desperate. It was a letter from Richard Caldwell. The man who had cornered me at the elegant rehearsal dinner and proudly told me that a black mechanic from the slums had no place in his aristocratic world was now writing to me from a dirty and overcrowded prison cell. He was begging like a beaten dog. He wrote that the overworked public defender assigned to his federal case was completely incompetent and that he was currently facing 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud. The immense arrogance and the disgusting racial superiority were completely gone from his written words. He was pleading with me to show mercy to an old man. He was asking me to lend him $50,000 so he could hire a decent private defense attorney to save the rest of his miserable life. I sat in the heavy leather chair in my study holding the cheap yellow paper in my hands. The fire in the massive stone hearth roared quietly, casting long, dancing shadows across the mahogany walls. I looked down at the desperate, frantic handwriting of Richard Caldwell. The man who had cornered me at the country club just a few weeks ago and demanded that I step aside so educated white men could manage my wealth was now begging for his life on a piece of prison stationery. I read the words, slowly analyzing every single pathetic sentence. Richard was asking me for $50,000 to hire a private defense attorney. He claimed that the public defender assigned to his federal wire fraud case was completely ignoring him. But even in his absolute desperation, Richard could not entirely hide his deep-rooted arrogance and his quiet racism. He wrote that he knew I was a reasonable man who understood the value of mercy. He wrote that people from my background certainly understood what it meant to face an unfair justice system, and that surely I could find it in my heart to help a fellow father. He even tried to justify his horrific insults from the rehearsal dinner. He claimed he had simply drank too much expensive scotch and that his words had been taken completely out of context. He wrote that he always respected my hard work as a mechanic from the South Side, and that we were practically brothers trying to do what was best for our children. It was a spectacular display of absolute delusion. Richard still believed that his fake pedigree entitled him to a second chance. He still believed that I was just a simple, uneducated laborer who would be flattered by his hollow apologies and hand over a fortune to save him. He did not understand that I had already completely erased his existence from my reality. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the old man sitting in a federal holding cell. I did not feel anger or satisfaction. I felt absolutely nothing. I stood up from my heavy leather chair and walked slowly over to the roaring fireplace. I held the yellow notebook paper out over the open flames. I did not say a word. I simply opened my fingers and let the letter drop. I stood there with my hands clasped behind my back and watched the cheap paper catch fire. The bright orange flames consumed the frantic handwriting in less than 5 seconds. The paper curled inward, turning black and brittle before crumbling into weightless gray ash. The ash floated upward, drawn into the dark chimney, and disappeared forever. The last remaining shred of the Caldwell family arrogance was completely incinerated in my home. They were officially nothing but dust. I turned my back to the fireplace and walked straight back to my mahogany desk. I did not spend another second thinking about Richard, Susan, or Trent. I sat down and pulled a thick stack of commercial shipping contracts toward me. The global logistics industry does not pause for family drama. I had 12 massive cargo ships waiting to be routed through the international supply chain, and I needed to optimize their fuel consumption before the morning markets opened. I picked up my heavy gold pen and began signing the authorization forms. To me, the entire situation with the Caldwell family was already closed. I treated them exactly how I treat a hostile corporate takeover. In the ruthless world of high-level logistics, when you discover that a subsidiary company is hiding toxic debt and corrupt management, you do not waste your time trying to rehabilitate them. You do not hold emotional meetings or write angry letters. You simply execute a swift and brutal liquidation. You sever all financial ties, you seize their valuable assets, and you let the market completely crush whatever is left. Trent Caldwell and his racist parents were nothing more than a highly toxic business merger that required immediate and permanent termination. I had identified the threat, I had isolated the risk, and I had neutralized the enemy. The transaction was over. My ledger was completely clean. As I was reviewing a complicated freight manifest, the heavy wooden doors of my study opened slowly. I looked up from my paperwork and saw my daughter Maya standing in the doorway. The transformation in her posture and her demeanor was absolutely striking. Just a few weeks ago, she was a stressed and anxious woman desperately trying to please a manipulative fraud. She had been carrying the heavy emotional burden of trying to fit into a fake aristocratic world that secretly despised her. But that naive girl was completely gone. The woman standing in my study today was the true heir to my empire. Maya walked across the expensive Persian rug with the calm and undeniable authority of a queen. She was wearing a simple dark blue dress that perfectly highlighted her growing pregnancy. Her shoulders were pulled back and her head was held high. The dark circles of stress under her eyes had completely vanished. She looked powerful and entirely in control of her own destiny. She walked over to my desk and placed a crisp, official-looking document right on top of my shipping manifests. I put down my gold pen and looked at the paper. It was a certified legal decree from the Cook County Family Court. I read the bold black text printed across the top of the page. It was an official name change authorization. Maya looked at me with a steady and unbreakable gaze. She did not raise her voice, but her words carried a massive weight. She told me that she had just left the courthouse. She said she had filed the necessary legal petitions to ensure that Trent Caldwell would have absolutely zero parental rights or legal claim to her unborn child. She explained that his federal convictions for identity theft and wire fraud made it incredibly easy for the judge to grant her request for sole and absolute custody. But that was not the most important part of the document. Maya pointed to the final paragraph on the page. She told me she had officially and permanently erased the Caldwell name from our future. She said her child was not going to carry the legacy of a pathetic criminal and a family of racist frauds. She told me that her baby was going to carry a name that commanded absolute respect in the city of Chicago. The document stated clearly that the unborn child would legally carry the last name Pierce. I looked at the legal document, and then I looked up at my brilliant, beautiful daughter. A deep and profound sense of pride swelled inside my chest. I had spent 40 years building a massive fortune and a terrifying reputation so that my family would never have to bow down to anyone. Seeing Maya step so effortlessly into her own power was the greatest reward I could ever ask for. She was no longer a victim. She was a Pierce. She knew how to protect her bloodline, and she knew how to eliminate a threat with absolute legal precision. I nodded slowly and handed the document back to her. I told her that she had made a very wise and highly strategic decision. I told her that the Pierce legacy was completely safe in her hands. Maya smiled a genuine and peaceful smile. She folded the document and held it safely against her chest. She looked around the quiet study, listening to the soft crackle of the fire burning in the hearth. The heavy tension that had haunted our lives for months was entirely gone. The house felt secure and absolutely impenetrable. Maya walked around the side of my massive desk and stood next to my leather chair. She looked down at the complex shipping contracts I was reviewing and let out a soft, thoughtful sigh. She placed her hand gently on my shoulder. She told me she had been thinking a lot about everything that had happened over the last few weeks. She said she understood why I had built the cross-collateralization trap. She understood why I had waited for Trent to expose his own criminal debts to the federal government. She knew that I had orchestrated the entire destruction perfectly to ensure that she would never face a single legal consequence. But she said there was still one specific detail that she could not figure out. Maya looked directly into my eyes. Her dark eyes were filled with a sharp and highly intelligent curiosity. She asked me to take her back to the very beginning. She reminded me of the night at the expensive downtown steakhouse when we were celebrating the engagement. She recalled the exact moment when Trent's phone lit up on the glass table and she had accused him of sending secret messages. She remembered how Trent had so smoothly and perfectly manipulated her by pulling out the fake architectural blueprints for the lake house. She said his performance had been absolutely flawless. He had played the devoted and loving fiancé so perfectly that she had completely broken down in tears of guilt. Maya leaned in slightly closer. She asked me how I managed to see right through his masterclass of deception. She asked me how I knew with absolute and terrifying certainty that Trent Caldwell was a complete fraud from the very first second he opened his mouth at that dinner table. She wanted to know what specific detail had triggered my predator instinct before I even saw the text message from his mistress. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and steepled my fingers together. I looked at the daughter I loved more than anything in this world. The room was completely silent except for the steady burning of the fire. I thought about the sheer arrogance of a man who believed he could walk into my presence and steal my most valuable treasure right out from under my nose. I looked at Maya, and a slow, cold, and highly calculated smile spread across my face. 2 months had passed since the federal raid at the downtown hotel. The bitter and unforgiving chill of the Chicago winter had finally softened into a mild and welcoming spring. I was sitting in a heavy wooden chair on the wrap-around porch of the lake house. This was the exact property that Trent Caldwell and his racist parents had tried so desperately to steal from me. It was not a dilapidated wooden cabin as they had so arrogantly assumed. It was a sprawling and magnificent architectural masterpiece of stone and cedar, sitting on a private elevated bluff overlooking the vast, deep blue expanse of Lake Michigan. The water stretched out perfectly flat and calm all the way to the distant horizon. It looked like an endless sheet of sapphire glass reflecting the clear sky above. The gentle breeze carrying the fresh scent of pine and fresh water rustled through the tall ancient trees surrounding the secluded property. Maya was sitting in the chair right next to me holding a ceramic mug of warm herbal tea. She looked completely radiant and entirely healthy. The dangerous and terrifying spikes in her blood pressure were a distant memory, now safely buried in the past. She was wearing a thick knitted sweater that comfortably draped over her very visible pregnancy. We were completely alone, surrounded by absolute peace. The toxic noise of the Caldwell family, the frantic lies, and the suffocating arrogance had been permanently eradicated from our existence. We sat in a comfortable and heavy silence for a long time, simply watching the golden sunlight dance across the rippling surface of the lake. Maya took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea and looked over at me. Her dark eyes were calm but filled with a sharp, intelligent curiosity. She brought up the question she had asked me back in my mahogany study. She wanted to know how I had seen right through Trent Caldwell at the very first engagement dinner. She wanted to know what specific detail had triggered my predator instinct before he even opened his mouth to lie about the architectural blueprints. I smiled a slow and very quiet smile. I rested my forearms on my knees and looked out at the endless water. I told my beautiful daughter that my instinct did not come from a single specific detail. It came from 40 years of surviving in a brutal world that constantly wanted to see me fail. I explained that when you build a massive logistics empire from the unforgiving streets of the south side of Chicago, you learn exactly how to read a man before he even takes a seat at your table. I told Maya that Trent wore his expensive tailored suit like a cheap Halloween costume. He spoke with a practiced and overly polished rhythm that completely lacked any genuine soul. But the absolute confirmation of his deceit came when he started talking about this very lake house. I looked deeply into Maya's eyes and explained the cold reality of the situation. I told her that when Trent pulled out those beautifully drawn architectural blueprints and claimed he was secretly remodeling the cabin for her, he thought he was delivering a masterclass in emotional manipulation. He thought his performance was absolutely flawless. But he had made one fatal and unbelievably arrogant mistake. He never bothered to do the real work. I told Maya that the county board had passed a highly publicized and extremely strict conservation zoning law over a year ago. It was legally impossible to obtain commercial permits to remodel or expand any structure on this specific coastline. If Trent had actually hired a legitimate high-end architectural firm, they would have told him immediately that the project was completely illegal. But Trent did not hire an architect. He simply printed a fake blueprint to cover up his tracks with his mistress. He arrogantly assumed that the old black mechanic sitting across the table was too uneducated to know the local property and zoning laws. I leaned back in my heavy wooden chair and looked at the beautiful, serene landscape I had worked my entire life to secure for my family. I shared the most valuable lesson I could ever teach my daughter. I told her that predators always think they are the smartest people in the room. They talk too much, they assume too much, and they completely underestimate the deafening power of silence. I explained that weak men feel a desperate and pathetic need to constantly announce their presence and boast about their intelligence. They fill the empty space with loud lies and grand illusions because they are terrified of being exposed as frauds. But a truly powerful man does not need to raise his voice or show his hand. A powerful man simply sits quietly, watches the enemy make critical mistakes, and gathers the heavy ammunition needed to completely destroy them. I told Maya that my silence at that dinner table was not confusion or submission. It was a perfectly laid trap. I let Trent believe his own lies because a man who thinks he is invisible is the easiest target to hunt. Maya listened to my words, absorbing every single syllable with a profound and quiet understanding. She gently placed her hand over her pregnant belly, tracing slow, protective circles against the soft fabric of her sweater. She looked out at the water, processing the brutal but absolutely necessary lesson I had just taught her. She realized that the world can be an incredibly cruel and unforgiving place, especially for people who look like us. She understood that kindness and generosity are beautiful traits, but they must always be guarded by a cold and impenetrable armor. She knew that I had acted with overwhelming ruthlessness to protect her and her unborn child. And instead of feeling afraid, she felt an immense and unbreakable sense of security. Maya told me she was ready to raise her child with that exact same titanium armor. She promised me that the Pierce legacy would never be compromised by a charming smile or a fake aristocrat. She was no longer the naive girl who fell for a charlatan. She was a strong, fierce matriarch who knew exactly how to defend her bloodline. The afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a rich golden light across the wooden deck of the porch. The air grew slightly cooler, carrying the crisp promise of the coming evening. I reached for the heavy crystal glass resting on the small table beside me. The amber liquid glowed warmly in the fading sunlight. I took a slow and satisfying sip of my expensive aged bourbon, feeling the smooth heat settle deeply in my chest. I looked out over the vast and endless expanse of Lake Michigan. The water was perfectly calm, untouched by the violent storms that had raged through our lives over the past few months. I thought about Trent Caldwell sitting in his dark federal holding cell, jumping at every single passing shadow and waiting in pure terror for the crime syndicate to collect their bloody debt. I smiled a quiet, peaceful smile. "Greed is not a weapon," I murmured into the cool evening breeze. "It is a noose." I did not hang Trent Caldwell. I just handed him the rope and let him tie the knot himself. Fade to black. The greatest lesson to take away from this story is that silence should never be mistaken for weakness. Predators operate on the loud, arrogant assumption that they are always the smartest people in the room. They view kindness as a vulnerability and use manipulation as their primary weapon. But true power does not need to boast or announce its presence. It simply observes, calculates, and strikes only when the trap is perfectly set. Never allow anyone to diminish your worth based on your background or your quiet demeanor. Protect your peace and your legacy with an unbreakable armor, because the most lethal response to absolute greed is simply letting it destroy itself. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments below how you would have handled a manipulator like Trent Caldwell.